Under the scorching sun of the Mojave Desert, where life seems impossible to exist, a woman staggers across the burning sand, her eyes dry from tears and despair. This is Mary, a mother who sacrificed her entire life for her son, loving, protecting, and forgiving him unconditionally. But that love was repaid with the coldest betrayal. Her son, Michael, who was once the only light in her life, is now the one who has led her to the brink of death. Without a word of explanation, without a drop of compassion, he abandoned her in the wilderness like a used object. Mary thought that was the end, but fate still had an unwritten chapter. In this barren place, where life is merely a luxury, a buried secret from the past begins to rise. And when the wheel of fate starts turning, Mary will not only fight to survive, she will return. And so the story begins. The heat of the sun burned Mary's skin, making her feel as if her entire body was in flames. The silence of the desert was only interrupted by the sound of the car engine that had stopped in the middle of nowhere. Michael breathed deeply, his sweaty hands gripping the steering wheel, his heart beating strongly, but he couldn't hesitate. Not now. "Get out of the car, Mom." Mary frowned. "What did you say?" "I said get out." His voice was harsh, cutting. This wasn't her son, not the boy she had raised with love, with sacrifices, with sleepless nights. "Michael, this doesn't make sense. What are we doing here?" He didn't answer. He got out of the car without looking at her, walked around the vehicle to open the passenger door. "Come on, Mom." He gently pulled her by the arm, but Mary didn't move. "I don't understand, Michael." Michael sighed, clenching his jaw. "Don't make this more difficult. Just get out of the car." Mary stared at him in disbelief. "Why are you doing this? Is it because of Jessica?" Mary's question hung in the air, stirring memories Michael would rather forget. She had seen it from the beginning. Jessica's cold politeness, the way her smile never reached her eyes when Mary visited. The subtle comments about mother-in-law problems Jessica would make at dinner parties, as if Mary were just an uncomfortable stereotype rather than a person. But he had ignored the signs, convinced that the two women he loved most would eventually form a bond. Instead, Jessica's resentment had grown, her whispers becoming more insistent. "She's holding you back. She calls too much. She's too dependent on you." Words that had seemed concerned at first now revealed their true nature as he stood in the desert heat, preparing to commit the unthinkable. He had chosen his wife over his mother, luxury over loyalty, and now he couldn't even look Mary in the eyes. Michael's face hardened. "Jessica only helped me see reality. We can't go on like this. You're always in the middle, always giving opinions, always interfering with our lives." "Michael, I'm your mother. I gave you life." Mary's voice trembled, but Michael didn't look at her. He just took her small purse from the back seat and threw it on the ground. "I can't do anything else." The words fell like stones on Mary. The hot wind dried her throat. "Michael, tell me this is a joke." But he had already gotten back into the car and started the engine. Mary felt vertigo in her stomach, a panic she had never known before. "Michael, don't do this. You can't leave me here." He closed his eyes for a second, then without saying anything more, stepped on the accelerator. The tires raised a cloud of dust that enveloped her, making her cough. "Michael, son." The sound of the engine faded away. The silhouette of the car grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. The silence of the desert became a warning. Mary stood there with her breathing agitated, her heart beating at full speed. There was nothing but sand, heat, and miles of arid land. If you think what just happened is cruel, wait until you see what awaits Mary. This story is just beginning. The sweat began to trickle down her face. She put a hand to her chest. "No, this isn't happening." But it was happening. Her own son had condemned her to die. The heat was unbearable. The sun was at its highest point. She tried to breathe deeply, but the dry air hurt her throat. She couldn't stay still. She looked in all directions, seeking anything, any sign of life. Nothing. She couldn't see a single road, not a post, not a shelter. She took a step forward. The sand sank beneath her feet. "Think, Mary, think. If she stayed there, she would die. If she walked aimlessly, she would also die. Fear paralyzed her. But then a thought crossed her mind. If Michael was capable of abandoning her this way, it meant he had never loved her, and that hurt more than the scorching sun on her skin. But she wouldn't give up. Not yet. She raised her head, fixed her gaze on the horizon, and began to walk. She stared at the path where her son had gone, just dust and desolation, nothing more. She took a step forward, her knees weakened. It can't be, she murmured, as if saying it aloud could change reality. She tried to move, but her feet sank into the hot sand. She bent down and picked up her purse, the only thing Michael had left her. She opened it with trembling hands, desperately searching for something useful: water, a phone, anything that would give her a chance. Nothing but a few coins, a crumpled handkerchief, and an old photo of Michael as a child. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the image. Her son smiled with eyes full of innocence, unaware of the cruelty he would one day be capable of committing. A knot formed in her throat. She breathed deeply, trying to calm herself. She couldn't lose her head. Not now. She looked around. The desert stretched as far as she could see, a plain without trees, without shade, without a trace of life. The hot wind hit her face, raising small clouds of sand that made her squint. She couldn't stay there, if Michael didn't come back. No, that's right. Michael wouldn't come back. Mary felt something inside her break. She clenched her jaw and raised her head. Instinct drove her forward. Staying in one place meant certain death. Each step was agony, the sun merciless overhead, turning the sand into burning coals beneath her worn sandals. The desert stretched endlessly before her, unchanging and indifferent to her plight. With each painful step, time seemed to slow, as if the wilderness itself was prolonging her suffering. After a while, she saw an elongated shadow on the sand. She looked up. It was a low mountain with some scattered stones. Maybe if she could reach it, she might find shelter. Her heart gave her a small push of hope, the first since her son had left her, but each step became more difficult. Her breathing was labored. The sun continued to beat down on her mercilessly. After what seemed like an eternity, she reached the base of the mountain. She looked for a place where she could sit and rest. She found a flat rock and collapsed onto it. The relief was instant. She took off her sandals and massaged her feet. The skin was red, almost burned. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind kept returning to the same question. Why? Why had Michael been capable of doing this to her? Why had he left her alone, condemned to die? She refused to believe he had always been like this. No, something had changed him. Jessica, her daughter-in-law, had never wanted her around. From the moment Michael married her, Mary felt her contempt, her coldness disguised as courtesy. Perhaps she had convinced him that abandoning her was for the best. But Michael wasn't a child. He had made the decision. He had left her. The pain in her chest intensified. She brought her hand to her neck, trying to breathe. The hot air burned her lungs. She looked at the sky. The sun was still there, unmoving, giving her no respite. And suddenly, fear hit her with all its force. If she didn't find water soon, she would die. She clenched her fists tightly. No, she wouldn't give up. She stood up, though her legs hurt. She put her sandals back on and looked around, seeking some direction to follow. She couldn't afford to waste time. The sun wouldn't wait for her, and the night in the desert wouldn't be merciful either. Mary moved slowly, dragging her feet across the hot sand. Her steps were clumsy, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't stop, not when death lurked in every corner of that infinite desert. The sun continued to punish her skin mercilessly. Her once blue dress was covered in dust, sticking to her body with sweat. Her head ached, a sharp, throbbing pain. The heat was suffocating, and at times her vision became blurry. She stopped for a second, trying to calm her agitated breathing. She couldn't panic. Fear wouldn't save her. She looked around, desperately seeking a sign of life, a signal that she wasn't completely alone in this hell. But the Mojave Desert stretched like a sea of sand and stone, without trees, without trace of water, without paths to guide her. Fear began to seep into her chest like a slow poison. Michael had really left her there to die. The image of her son accelerating the car and disappearing into the distance returned to her mind like a brutal blow. Why? How could he be so cruel? Mary closed her eyes, trying to drown the pain in her chest. She had no time to cry. If she lost control, if she let herself be consumed by sadness, she wouldn't last much longer. She took another staggering step, then another. Each movement was a titanic effort. Her legs burned with fatigue, but fear kept her on her feet. She kept walking. She had no idea how much time had passed. Everything was confusing. The sun didn't go down. The heat didn't yield. The desert seemed eternal. Then, something changed a sound. Mary stopped abruptly, her heart pounding against her chest. Had she heard correctly? The wind blew, raising dust around her, as if trying to erase any hope. And then she heard it again, a distant noise, difficult to identify. She turned quickly, her heart in her throat. For an instant, she thought she saw something moving in the distance. Could it be a vehicle? An animal? She rubbed her eyes, trying to focus her vision, but the blinding light of the sun made everything appear distorted. She heard the sound again. It was an intermittent, muffled hum, her chest filled with hope. She tried to run, but her legs didn't respond. Her feet sank into the sand, and she fell to her knees with a choked moan. She forced herself to get up. The sound disappeared. "No, no," she murmured, her voice barely audible. It couldn't have been her imagination. It couldn't be a simple mirage. She stood still, panting, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't happen. The desert reclaimed its absolute silence, as if mocking her. Mary felt a knot in her throat. What was she going to do? Fatigue was overtaking her, and for the first time, the idea of giving up crossed her mind. No, she refused to accept it. If she stopped, if she let herself fall, she would die right there. She clenched her fists tightly and forced her legs to move again. She kept walking. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The sun began to set on the horizon, tinting the sky a reddish color. That meant night would come soon, and with it, the merciless cold of the desert. Mary swallowed, but her throat burned. With each passing minute, her body weakened more. She knew she would soon have to stop and look for shelter. But if she stopped? If no one found her? She breathed deeply, trying to ignore the fear that consumed her. She had no choice but to keep going, even though each step was a battle, even as her own mind began to betray her. Because something inside her told her that her worst test had not yet begun. The sun completed its descent on the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with a burning red that would soon give way to darkness. Mary knew she didn't have much time left before night fell completely, and night in the desert could be her death sentence. Each step she took cost her more. Her feet hurt with an unbearable intensity. The skin burned from the friction of the hot sand, and wounds began to open, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The wind blew stronger, dragging with it clouds of dust that stuck to her sweaty skin, making her feel as if thousands of tiny needles were piercing her face. She breathed deeply, but the dry, burning air scorched her throat. She couldn't think clearly. Fatigue made her feel as if her entire body weighed tons. And then she saw it, a few meters away, amid the vastness of the desert. A small rock formation rose like a sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a perfect shelter, but at least it would provide some cover against the wind and the night frost. The simple fact of having a destination made her move more quickly, or at least try to. She forced herself to advance, though her legs protested with each step. Every time she moved her feet, she felt as if her skin was tearing a little more. But she had to get there. When she finally reached the rock, she nearly collapsed onto it. She fell back with her eyes closed and her breathing ragged. Her lungs burned, and her mouth was so dry that every time she tried to swallow, she felt a pain that ran down her entire throat. The silence around her was disturbing. Only the wind and the sound of her own breathing interrupted the stillness of the desert. Mary opened her eyes and looked at the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, shining with an intensity impossible to see in the city. But she couldn't be distracted. She knew the desert hid dangers even worse than the scorching heat of the day, the cold, the animals, and worst of all, absolute solitude. She settled against the rock, hugging herself, trying to conserve what little heat her body still had. The wind was growing stronger, raising whirlwinds of sand that forced her to bury her face in her arms. Her body trembled, but not just from the cold. Fear was eating her from within. What would happen if they never found her? What would happen if she woke up and didn't have the strength to keep walking? She didn't want to think about that. She closed her eyes, trying to block the dark thoughts that threatened to consume her. And then she heard something, a noise, a creak. She opened her eyes suddenly and remained completely still. The sound repeated. It was a footstep. Someone or something was moving near her. She held her breath, staying motionless with tense muscles. The sound grew louder. She slowly turned her head, trying to see beyond the shadow of the rocks, and then she saw it, a silhouette in the darkness. She couldn't distinguish exactly what it was, but it was there, waiting, lurking. Mary felt her heart racing in her chest. She had nothing to defend herself with. If it was a wild animal, she had no chance. She took a stone from the ground with trembling fingers. It wasn't much, but if she had to fight, she would. The sound returned, this time closer. A shiver ran down her spine. She remained completely still. She heard a heavy breath. Something was there, and it was watching her. Panic paralyzed her. But before she could react, a howl tore through the night-long, high-pitched, terrifying. Mary felt the blood freeze in her veins. And then she understood. She wasn't alone, and something was hunting her in the darkness. Dawn slid over the desert with a golden, deceptive light. It seemed beautiful, a picture of tranquility painted with warm colors. But Mary knew the truth. She knew the desert had no mercy. Every muscle in her body screamed in pain when she tried to move. Her back felt like a rigid board after having spent the night leaning against the cold rock. Her feet burned, covered in wounds from the endless walk of the previous day. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night awake, with her eyes open in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds that surrounded her. More than once, she had felt something moving nearby, something watching her, but nothing had come too close. Even with the sun beginning to rise over the horizon, Mary knew she had to move before the heat became unbearable again. She tried to stand, but a sudden dizziness forced her to lean on the rock. Her throat was completely dry, as if she had swallowed sand. She had to find water. That became her only mission. She moved slowly, dragging her feet, leaving a trail of weak footprints in the sand. The sun rose rapidly, and with each passing minute, her shadow grew shorter. She knew that in a few hours the temperature would soar, becoming unbearable, but she couldn't stop. Each step was a challenge. Her legs trembled, her lips were so dry and cracked that every time she tried to moisten them with her tongue, she only felt a sharp burning. At some point along the way, her mind began to play tricks on her. In the distance, she thought she saw a flash. She stopped abruptly, her heart beating hard. Was it water? A lake? She rubbed her eyes with trembling hands and looked again. There it was, bright, waiting for her. With renewed strength, she quickened her pace. Every time she looked up, the flash was still there, calling to her. But as she walked, something began to feel strange. She didn't seem to be getting any closer. The desert was playing with her mind. Her heart sank. It was a mirage. Despair fell on her like an avalanche. A sob escaped her cracked lips. She brought her hands to her face, shaking her head. She couldn't collapse. She couldn't. She breathed deeply, trying to find some calm. If she couldn't trust her eyes, she had to trust her instinct. She began walking again, but this time more cautiously. The heat was becoming more brutal. Her skin burned. Her head throbbed with an unbearable pain. And then it happened. The ground seemed to move beneath her feet. She staggered. Everything spun around her. Her legs gave way. She fell to her knees on the burning sand. The pain was instant, but she didn't have the strength to get up. The desert was consuming her. It was defeating her. She felt her consciousness slipping away bit by bit. The sounds around her became distant. Her breathing was shallow. For the first time, the thoughts settled in her mind with total clarity. She was going to die there, Alone, forgotten, betrayed. Michael would never return, and soon the desert would swallow her body without a trace. Her eyelids closed slowly, everything went dark. And then something cold touched her face, a different breeze from the previous ones, fresh. Mary opened her eyes with difficulty. The wind was coming from somewhere. With what little strength she had left, she raised her head and looked around. To her right, a small ravine opened between the rocks. The wind was coming from there. If there was wind, there was shade. There was a possibility, one last chance. She dragged herself with trembling hands, using every ounce of energy she had left. Each movement was torture, but she didn't give up. When she finally crossed the entrance of the ravine, she felt instant relief. The sun no longer hit her directly. The air was fresher. Her heart beat strongly, and then she saw it. A few meters from where she was, something gleamed between the rocks, a small puddle of water, small but real. Mary approached, crawling desperately. It didn't matter if the water was dirty. Nothing mattered. She plunged her trembling hands into the puddle and drank. The fresh liquid ran down her throat like a miraculous balm. The relief was immediate. The water saved her life. But as she drank, something in the distance made her stop. A sound, a strange murmur. Someone else was there. She wasn't alone. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room with a monotonous sound, but it failed to calm the tension that hung in the air. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze lost on the floor. 2 days had passed since he left his mother in the desert, 2 days in which he hadn't been able to sleep well, in which his mind kept taking him back to that moment. Mary's face when she realized what was happening, her eyes full of disbelief, the trembling in her voice when she pleaded. He had thought that over time he would feel relieved, that getting rid of her would bring peace to his life with Jessica, but it hadn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother standing alone in the middle of nowhere, watching as he drove away without looking back. "Michael, please, just get over it." Jessica's voice pulled him from his thoughts. His wife was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, arms crossed and an expression of annoyance on her face. She wore a silk robe and had her hair pulled back in a high ponytail. "I can't sleep." "That's not my problem." Jessica walked with firm steps to the dresser, picked up her phone, and checked the screen without even looking at him. "If you keep walking around with that funeral face, people are going to start suspecting. We said this was for the best, didn't we? So act like a man." Michael ran a hand over his face. "She's my mother, Jessica." She laughed. It was cold. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. Jessica approached and sat next to him, placing a hand on his knee. "Listen, honey, if you keep this up, you'll end up driving yourself crazy. What we did was necessary. She was getting in the way of our lives too much. Besides, it's not like you're the first son to leave his mother in a nursing home or somewhere else." Michael closed his eyes and exhaled forcefully. I don't know if I can live with this." Jessica stood up abruptly, fed up. "For God's sake, Michael, I married a man, not a crybaby." Michael looked at her, annoyed. "It's not just about her, it's about me, about who I am. Don't start with that. You're a successful man with a bright future. But if you keep wallowing in guilt, you'll end up ruining everything, and I'm not going to stay with a failure." The threat was clear. Jessica didn't need to say more. Michael ran his hands through his hair and stood up. "I need a drink." He left the room without saying anything else. In the kitchen, he took out a bottle of whiskey and poured some into a glass. He stood there, observing the golden liquid while his mind kept reproducing the same image. Mary standing in the desert, getting further and further away in the rearview mirror. He drank in one gulp, but the burning of the alcohol wasn't enough to erase his anguish. What would his mother be doing at that moment? Would she still be alive? He shook his head. He couldn't allow himself to think about that. He decided to focus on his work. He needed to distract himself, to get back into a routine. The next day, he would go to the office early and act as if everything was fine, as if nothing had happened. But what Michael didn't know was that fate wouldn't let him forget so easily. The echo of the wind resonated among the rocks, a hollow, monotonous whisper that accompanied Mary's ragged breathing. Her entire body ached. Her legs trembled. Her feet burned as if she were walking on hot coals. But the worst was the thirst. Although she had found that small puddle of water, her body was already too weak. Each sip she had taken was insufficient to quell the dryness in her throat, the sensation that her skin was cracking from within. She leaned against the nearest rock, trying to regain her strength. Her head pounded forcefully, and her vision blurred at times. She knew her body was giving in, and the worst part was that in this state, her mind was also beginning to betray her. For the first time, she felt she wasn't alone. She pressed her lips together, containing the panic. She breathed deeply and looked around. Nothing. But she felt it. Something or someone was watching her. The air seemed denser, as if the desert were holding its breath along with her. Her instinct screamed that she wasn't safe. She closed her eyes for a moment. Maybe they were just hallucinations. Her body was weak, her mind tired. Perhaps her own fear was playing tricks on her. But then a sound made her shudder. A creak of stones, a movement. Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. She wasn't alone. She couldn't see anything clearly, but her skin prickled with the certainty that something was approaching. Her fingers clutched at the fabric of her dress, trying to control the trembling in her body. She wanted to move, wanted to flee, but her legs wouldn't respond. A new sound, closer. Mary swallowed with difficulty. Her breathing was so weak she barely felt the air entering her lungs. Slowly, she turned her head, and then she saw it. Two bright eyes in the darkness, small but fixed on her. Panic hit her immediately. A coyote? A desert wolf? The animal remained motionless, hidden among the shadows. Its eyes blinked occasionally, reflecting what little light remained in the sky. Mary felt a knot in her throat. She knew that if she showed fear, if she made a sudden movement, the animal might attack. The wind intensified, the animal moved forward a few steps. It was small but agilely a desert fox. Mary felt momentary relief. Foxes didn't attack humans, not like coyotes or wolves. But the mere presence of a predator reminded her that she wasn't safe. The animal sniffed the air and then slowly moved away, disappearing among the rocks. Mary exhaled, not realizing she had been holding her breath. But then something worse happened. The air turned colder. The sun had completely set, and with its disappearance, the heat of the desert vanished. A shiver ran through her. Night had arrived, and with the night, the true hell began. The cold was immediate, not a normal cold, but a cutting one, like invisible blades stabbing into her skin. Mary hugged herself, trying to conserve what little heat she had. Her teeth began to chatter. The sand beneath her feet, which hours before had been an oven, now seemed like ice. The contrast was unbearable. She tried to move, but her body was rigid, exhausted. She couldn't stay there. If she didn't find warmth, she would freeze to death before dawn. She walked, staggering, looking for something, anything that would protect her from the icy wind. She found a gap between two rocks. It wasn't large, but it would serve as shelter. She squeezed herself in there as best she could, curling her body to conserve heat. The wind whistled between the stones, creating a lugubrious sound. Mary closed her eyes and tried to think of something else, tried to remember happy moments, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee in her house, the sound of Michael laughing when he was a child, the sensation of small hands holding her tightly as they walked together down the street. Her son who had abandoned her. The pain returned with greater force than ever. Tears rolled down her face, silent, mixing with the dust on her skin. She wanted to hate him, wanted to curse his name, wish she had never given him life, but she couldn't. Because despite everything, despite the suffering, she still loved him, and that was her worst punishment. The cold enveloped her like a shroud of death. Her body surrendered bit by bit. Her mind floated between reality and dreams. But just before losing consciousness, in the distance, a sound made her open her eyes. A different noise. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals, it was something else, something human. Someone was nearby. The sound she had heard still resonated in her Minden echo, a murmur that didn't belong to the wind or the desert animals. It was something more, something human. Mary opened her eyes with effort. Her body was numb from the cold and exhaustion. Every muscle ached as if it had been beaten, and thirst still gripped her throat like a closed fist. She blinked several times, trying to focus her vision in the gloom. The night continued to envelop everything around her, dark and dense like an abyss without end. Silence. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, that her delirious mind, dehydrated and feverish, was playing a cruel joke on her. But then there it was again, a faint sound, as if someone were treading on the sand in the distance. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't alone. Fear slid down her spine like an icy poison. Who could be in the middle of the desert at this hour? She stayed still, listening. Nothing. Her pulse was the only thing breaking the silence. She looked around, but darkness covered everything. She didn't know what to do. If she shouted for help, what if the person there didn't come with good intentions? If she remained silent, would that presence leave without realizing she was there? A knot formed in her throat, and then she saw it. A faint, distant flash, but real. It was a reflection of light. Her heart skipped a beat. A flashlight? A car? Someone else lost like her? She rubbed her eyes desperately. She couldn't lose this opportunity. She took a breath, filling her lungs with cold air, and tried to stand up. Her legs trembled, her body wavered, but she forced herself to stay on her feet. She couldn't let them find her like this. She had to move. She gritted her teeth and began to walk, dragging her feet across the sand. Each step was torture. Her head spun, but she continued moving forward. The reflection appeared again, closer ray of light bouncing off something. Then an idea crossed her mind. She fumbled in her dress. Her hands found the only thing she had, a piece of glass she had picked up earlier without knowing exactly why. She held it in her trembling hand. If the reflection was light, she could do the same. She turned the glass in her hand, trying to make it catch what little light there was. She tilted it. Nothing. She moved it again. A small flash, insufficient. She pressed her lips together and tried again. This time the reflection shone for a second, and then she saw it. The light, a flashlight moving in the distance. Her chest filled with hope. Someone had seen her. She didn't know who, didn't know how they would react, but it was her only chance. With the last strength she had left, she waved the glass desperately, trying to reflect the moonlight once, twice, and then the light in the distance stopped. Mary held her breath. The silence was absolute for an instant. She feared it was too late, that the person on the other side hadn't understood, that they had confused her with a simple reflection in the sand. Michael collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. He had lost his job. Jessica no longer saw him as a man worthy of her attention. And his mother continued to be a shadow in his conscience, a ghost that tormented him every night. He ran a hand over his face and took his phone. Without thinking too much, he opened his bank account. His eyes scanned the screen, and his stomach turned. The money in his account was no longer enough to maintain the life he had with Jessica. He bit his lip and forced himself to think. He could look for another job, but what company would hire him now? He had been acting like a ghost in the office for weeks before being fired. His reputation was tarnished. He needed money quickly. It was then that an idea crossed his mind. He got up from the sofa and walked to his bedroom. He opened the closet and took out a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were several expensive pieces of jewelry that his mother had kept preciously when he was a child. Michael remembered the last time Mary had shown him those jewels. "These belong to your grandmother," she had told him sweetly. "They're the only valuable things we have left." They were family heirlooms, something his mother would never have sold, no matter how difficult things got. But he didn't have that kind of scruples. He took the pieces of gold and put them in a small bag. He left the house without thinking too much, without stopping to consider what he was doing. He knew there was a pawn shop a few blocks ahead. He walked with the bag in his hand, feeling the weight of his decision with each step. When he arrived, the place was almost empty. A man with a gray beard looked at him from the other side of the counter. "What do you have?" he asked with a raspy voice. Michael opened the bag and let the jewels fall onto the glass. The man whistled. "Good pieces. Where did you get them from?" It doesn't matter, responded Michael impatiently. How much will you give me for them? The man inspected them carefully. I could offer you $20,000. Michael gritted his teeth. That's worth much more. The man shrugged. If you want more, find yourself another place. Michael hesitated, but he didn't have time to haggle. Fine. The man took out a wad of bills and handed them to him. Michael took them with trembling hands. He had sold his mother's jewels, the only valuable pieces that Mary had protected all her life. When he left the pawn shop, he felt the air leave him. He couldn't sink any lower. Or could he? He breathed deeply and walked back home, but when he arrived, Jessica was already waiting for him in the living room with her arms crossed. Where were you? She asked with suspicion. Michael dropped the money on the table. Here you have it, Jessica. He had reached the point of no return, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if he still had time to change his destiny. The light of dawn entered timidly through the window, bathing the room with a warm glow. Mary woke up feeling a strange sensation of peace, one she didn't remember having felt in a long time. She stayed in bed for a few seconds, enjoying the sound of the wind brushing against the curtains and the distant murmur of the street. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wake up with her heart constricted by sadness. She got up calmly, fixed the bed carefully, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection returned the image of a different woman. There were still shadows of fatigue on her face, but her eyes were no longer empty. She dressed in a simple blouse and a long skirt, pulled her hair back in a bun, and left the room with firm steps. In the kitchen, Sophie was already preparing coffee. Good morning, she greeted with a smile. Mary returned the smile. Good morning. Ernest went to the store early to arrange the merchandise, but he said he's waiting for you to open. Mary nodded, taking a cup of hot coffee between her hands. I'm glad. I want to work. Sophie observed her attentively. You look different today. Mary blew softly on the surface of the coffee before responding. I think for the first time I'm accepting that my life changed. Sophie smiled tenderly. That's the first step. When Mary arrived at the store, Ernest was already behind the counter, counting bills and checking the cash register. Good morning, Mary, he greeted without looking up. Good morning, Ernest. What do we have for today? Ernest closed the drawer and turned to her with a smile. New bags of beans and sugar arrived. If you can arrange them on the shelves, I'd appreciate it. Mary nodded and got to work. As she worked, she realized how much she enjoyed the routine of the store. There was something comforting in arranging products, in seeing customers come and go, in hearing the morning greetings from the neighborhood people. Each day, she felt a little more part of something. In mid-morning, an elderly lady with gray hair and a flowered dress entered. Good morning, Mrs. Mary, she greeted with kindness. Mary blinked, surprised. How do you know my name? The woman smiled. Everyone here talks about you. They say Ernest and Sophie saved you and that now you're part of the store. Mary felt a slight warmth in her chest. They've treated me with great kindness. They're good people. The woman took a package of bread and placed it on the counter. And you seem to be too. Mary didn't know how to respond. Before, her life had revolved around being Michael's mother, around existing only for him. But now, for the first time, she felt she was something more than that. I'm glad to see you well, Mrs. Mary, said the woman before paying and leaving the store. Mary remained silent for a few seconds. She felt strong, alive, capable of moving forward. But just when she thought her past was being left behind, a conversation in the store shook her completely. Did you hear what happened to Mr. Michael? Murmured a man near the counter. Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. Ernest, who was attending, looked up with curiosity. Michael, the businessman? Yes, they fired him. They say they let him go a few days ago. Mary's heart began to beat forcefully. And his wife? Asked Ernest. The man made a gesture with his hand. She left. She wasn't going to stay with a bankrupt man. Mary felt her body tense. Michael was alone, ruined, abandoned. For an instant, she didn't know what to feel. Did he deserve her pity, or was it simply the consequence of his own decisions? She breathed deeply and tried to concentrate on what she was doing, But an idea planted itself in her mind like a seed impossible to uproot. Michael was suffering, just as she had suffered. Did that mean she should forgive him, or did it mean that destiny was doing justice? She didn't have the answer, but deep down, she knew she would soon have to face it. Michael woke up with a strange sensation in his chest. Something was wrong. A heavy silence filled the house, one different from what he had endured in recent weeks. He rubbed his face with his hands before getting up. He looked around. His bedroom was disordered, with wrinkled clothes on the chair, empty bottles on the floor, and the curtains closed, preventing the sunlight from illuminating the mess his life had become. But there was something else, an emptiness, something that hadn't been there before. With a strange feeling of unease, he got up and left the room. He walked barefoot down the hallway, his heart beating hard. When he reached the living room, his breathing stopped. Next to the door, neatly aligned, were 3 large suitcases. He blinked several times, trying to process what he was seeing. He didn't need to ask who they belonged to. He knew immediately. Jessica was leaving. For some reason, seeing it with his own eyes hurt more than he had imagined. It wasn't that he hadn't expected it. He had felt the detachment in her voice, in her gaze, in the coldness with which she had treated him since he lost his job. But seeing her packing her life in a few suitcases made reality lodge in his chest like a knife. He heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. Jessica came out with her phone in hand, typing a message with indifference. She didn't even flinch when she saw him standing there, staring at her luggage. "You're leaving?" he asked with a hoarse voice. Jessica didn't even look up from her phone. "Yes." Michael gritted his teeth. "And you were going to leave without telling me anything?" She sighed as if the conversation was tedious to her. It wasn't worth the argument. Michael felt something break inside him. "Jessica, we've been together for years, and this is how everything ends?" She finally raised her gaze. That's how things end when a person stops being useful to the other. Michael felt his stomach turn. "I can't believe what you're saying." Jessica put the phone on the table and crossed her arms. "I don't know why you're surprised. You always knew who I was. I never lied to you about what I wanted in life." Michael shook his head. "I thought what we had was real." Jessica let out a cold laugh. "It was, while it suited me." Michael felt a knot in his throat. "What are you saying?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "Look, Michael, you gave me what I needed when it suited me. A good house, stability, comfort. But now you're a ruined man, without a job and without a future. And what does that mean?" She looked at him with disdain. "That you no longer have anything to offer me." Michael felt anger rising through his body like fire. "I can't believe you're so cynical." She shrugged. "It's not cynicism, it's realism." Michael closed his fists. "That easy? You get rid of me just like that?" "That easy. You got rid of your mother." The words hit him like a bucket of ice water. The entire world seemed to stop. Jessica looked at him steadily with a slight smile on her lips. Mary sighed, wiping her hands on the apron. "It feels good." Ernest appeared from the storeroom with a box in his hands. "It seems we're going to have to get used to seeing you here every day." Mary smiled shyly. "If you don't mind, I think I'd like to stay longer." Sophie embraced her affectionately. "This is your home, Mary. Stay as long as you want." Mary felt her eyes moisten. For the first time in a long time, she felt she belonged somewhere. But in the deepest part of her heart, a shadow still lurked, because although she tried to ignore it, she knew that at some point she would have to face her past. The afternoon sun filtered through the store window, projecting long shadows on the worn tile floor. Mary was finishing arranging the coffee jars on the shelf when a shiver ran down her spine. A week had passed since she began working with Ernest and Sophie, a week in which little by little she had regained strength in her body and calm in her mind. But there was something that wouldn't leave her in peace: the past. No matter how hard she tried to move forward, there were nights when she woke up startled, with the sensation that the desert sand still covered her. Other times, she dreamed of Michael, of his laughter as a child, of his small arms surrounding her when he was a defenseless child. But then the image changed, and she would see again his cold eyes, his back moving away as he left her abandoned. "Mary," Sophie's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She blinked and found herself facing her friend's concerned gaze. I called you 3 times. Mary shook her head, trying to clear her mind. I'm sorry, I got distracted. Sophie crossed her arms. You've been like this all morning. Do you want to talk? Mary hesitated. She didn't want to burden Sophie with her thoughts, but at the same time, she felt that if she kept everything inside, she would end up suffocating. She sighed and leaned on the counter. I can't stop thinking about him. Sophie didn't need to ask who she was referring to. It's normal. He was your son all your life, Mary. Mary swallowed hard. But he's not the boy I raised anymore. I don't know at what point he became a man capable of doing me so much harm. Sophie took her hand sweetly. Don't feel guilty for what he did. People make their own decisions, and he made the worst of all. Mary pressed her lips together, feeling a knot in her throat. Sometimes I wonder if he feels any remorse, if he ever thinks of me. Sophie remained silent for a moment before responding. Maybe yes, maybe no, but that shouldn't define what you'll do with your life now. Mary lowered her gaze. I don't know how to move forward. Sophie squeezed her hand more firmly. One day at a time, Mary. Mary sighed and nodded. The tinkling of the door's bell was heard. Good afternoon, greeted Ernest as he entered with a sack of sugar on his shoulder. Mary hurried to help him, and in a matter of minutes, her conversation with Sophie took second place. But although her hands were busy, her mind remained trapped in the same question. Did Michael think of her? Michael drank the last sip of his whiskey before putting the glass on the table. The living room was in semi-darkness, with the curtains closed and the air heavy with alcohol and tobacco. He had been unable to sleep well for days, unable to concentrate at work. The weight of what he had done pursued him like a shadow impossible to ignore. He had tried to do what Jessica told him to move on with his life, not to look back, but it was impossible because every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother. And not as he remembered her at home, cooking or laughing with him when he was a child. No, he saw her in the desert, alone, with a pleading look, with trembling hands. He saw her reflection in the rearview mirror of the car as he drove away. Enough, he murmured, pressing his head with his hands. He stood up and walked, staggering, to the wine cellar in search of another bottle, but he found nothing. Frustrated, he slammed the door shut. Jessica entered the kitchen with her phone in her hand and a look of contempt. Are you going to continue with this? Michael frowned. With what? With your show of guilt and misery? Jessica asked, looking at him with disdain. Michael felt a pang of anger in his chest. You have no idea how I feel. Jessica sighed with annoyance. I already told you, get over it. We're not going to recover the time lost worrying about someone who's no longer here. Michael felt his blood freeze. What did you say? Jessica raised an eyebrow. What you heard. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. How can you talk like that? Jessica shrugged. Because it's the truth. If she were alive, someone would have found her. We would have heard something. Michael felt his stomach turn. The idea that his mother might really be dead was something he couldn't handle. Shut up, he murmured with a trembling voice. Jessica approached and put a hand on his face with a cruel smile. You have 2 options, love. Either you continue drowning in this until it drives you crazy, or you move forward with me. Michael looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. It was an ultimatum. If he continued on this path of guilt and remorse, he would lose everything. But if he forgot, he could move forward with Jessica, with the life they had built together. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He had to make a decision. Michael woke up with a dry mouth and a sharp pain in his head. He brought a hand to his forehead, feeling the weight of the whiskey he had drunk the night before. On the living room table, there were still 2 dirty glasses and an almost empty bottle. He looked around and found himself amid the disorder he had been accumulating in his house. Clothes thrown on the sofa, dirty dishes in the kitchen, the ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Jessica wasn't there. For days, she had been spending more time outside the house than inside. She left without saying where she was going, and returned at dawn, when he was already too tired or drunk to ask her anything. He rubbed his face with both hands and stood up with difficulty. He knew he had to pull himself together, but every time he tried, guilt came back to drown him. Mary, his mother. He had tried to convince himself that what they did was right, that leaving her in the desert was a necessary decision, but the weight in his chest belied it. Sometimes he found himself looking at the phone with the impulse to dial her number, but he remembered there was no one to answer, because he had condemned her to disappear. He forced himself to get up and get into the shower. The cold water woke him up a bit, but not enough to erase the feeling of emptiness that accompanied him. He dressed hurriedly and took his car keys. If there was something that could distract him, it was work. But when he arrived at the office, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The hallways were quieter than normal. The looks from his colleagues were evasive. When he entered his office, his assistant was waiting for him with a worried expression. "Sir, Mr. Ortega wants to see you in his office." Michael frowned. "Ortega? For what?" The woman hesitated before responding. "I don't know, but it seems important." Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. He left his briefcase on the desk and walked with a firm step toward the director's office. When he entered, Ortega was sitting behind his enormous mahogany desk with his hands crossed and a serious expression on his face. "Sit down, Michael." Michael obeyed without saying anything. Ortega sighed before speaking. "I won't beat around the bush. The company has made the decision to make some cuts, and your position is among those that will be eliminated." Michael felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. "You're firing me?" Ortega looked at him with pity. "It's not personal. They're decisions from the board of directors." Michael clenched his fists. "I've worked here for years. And your performance in the last month has been concerning." Michael felt his blood boil. "You can't do this to me." Ortega shook his head. "It's already decided. You'll receive your severance next week." Michael was left speechless. He got up from the chair with a pale face. He had lost his job, his stability, all because of the guilt that was eating him from within. He left the office without saying goodbye to anyone. When he arrived home, he found Jessica in the living room, talking on the phone and laughing as if nothing mattered. When she saw him, her expression changed. "So, how did it go? Did they fire you?" Michael glared at her. "How do you know?" Jessica smiled coldly. "I know everything, Michael. You went from being successful to now having a loser in my living room." Michael stared at her. "Loser?" "Yes, Michael. You've become a burden." Jessica's words were a direct blow to his pride. But what hurt him most wasn't what she said, but the certainty that she really saw him that way, as an encumbrance, just as he had seen his mother. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was to be abandoned and the desperation of knowing it was too late to fix what he had done. Michael remained silent after hearing Jessica's words. Something inside him broke, but not in the way he expected. Until that moment, he had always been afraid of losing her, afraid she would see him as someone weak, as a man who couldn't give her the life she deserved. But for the first time, he wondered if it was really worth continuing with her. Jessica gave him one last look of contempt before taking her purse and leaving the house without saying goodbye. The door closed with a dry bang, leaving behind an unbearable silence. Mary looked up, surprised. "You want me to stay?" "Of course. You have nowhere to go and we have space in the house." Mary felt a mixture of relief and fear. All her life she had been tied to a home that no longer existed, to a son who had abandoned her without looking back. Now a pair of strangers offered her something that not even her own flesh and blood had given her: refuge, company, care. But could she accept it? "I don't want to be a burden to you," she murmured. Sophie shook her head. "You're not. But if you really want to thank us, when you feel better, help us in the store." Mary raised her eyebrows. "You have a store?" Sophie nodded. "We sell basic products in the center of the city. Ernest has worked there all his life, and I help him with what I can." Mary didn't respond immediately. The idea of working again after everything that had happened seemed impossible, but it also filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. "What do you say?" asked Sophie with a smile. Mary inhaled deeply. She had spent her entire life waiting to be valued by Michael, by a son who never saw everything she did for him. Maybe it was time to stop waiting. "I'll try," she responded with a firm voice. As Mary was finding her way in this new life, miles away, her son's world was beginning to collapse. The weight of his actions was catching up to him in ways he never anticipated. Sophie squeezed her hand affectionately. "That's what I wanted to hear." A noise at the door made them turn their heads. Ernest entered with his slow stride and his serious but kind expression. "I see you've already talked about the matter." Sophie stood up. "Yes, Mary agreed to stay and help us in the store." Ernest nodded with satisfaction. "Good decision. No one deserves to be alone in this world." Mary felt her chest tighten. All her life she had thought her place was beside Michael, that he was her only family. But now she had a new opportunity, a new path, and this time she wasn't going to waste it. Michael arrived home later than usual. His head throbbed forcefully, as if a hammer were hitting his skull without rest. He had spent the entire day at the office trying to concentrate on work, on anything that would distract him from the sensation eating him from inside, but he couldn't. No matter how hard he tried, the image of his mother kept appearing in his mind. Mary standing in the desert with a contorted face, her trembling hands trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. Him, her son, her only family, the man who had abandoned her. He sighed forcefully and loosened his tie before opening the door of the house. All he wanted was to drink something strong, take a shower, and sleep. Maybe that way, at least for a few hours, he could silence the voices in his head. But as soon as he set foot in the living room, he knew his night would be even worse than he imagined. Jessica was sitting on the sofa with her legs crossed and a glass of wine in her hand. Her expression was that of someone who had been waiting patiently, with the intention of attacking at the precise moment. Michael frowned. "Why do you have that face?" Jessica took a sip of her wine before answering. "Where were you all day?" "Working, as always." "Ah, of course," she said with a sarcastic smile, "because you're a very busy man." Michael snorted and put the keys on the table. "What's this about, Jessica?" "I'm tired." "I'm tired too," she replied, standing up. She walked toward him with calculated movements, like a predator stalking its prey. "Tired of seeing you with that martyr face, as if you were the victim of all this." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his anger. "I don't want to argue." "Well, I do." Jessica gently pushed him with a finger on his chest. "I want you to stop behaving like a child and accept that we did what we had to do." Michael looked at her coldly. "What we had to do?" "Yes, Mary had no place in our lives." Jessica's words hit his chest like a dagger. "She was my mother, Jessica." Jessica laughed as if what he had just said was ridiculous. "And, did she support you? Did she give you anything?" "No, Michael, she was just a burden." Michael felt his stomach turn. He looked at Jessica as if seeing her for the first time. He always knew she didn't want Mary around. She always saw her as a nuisance. But hearing her speak like this, with that coldness, made a shiver run down his spine. "How can you be so cruel?" Jessica huffed and rolled her eyes. "I'm not cruel, I'm realistic. People who contribute nothing to our lives must leave. It's that simple." Michael felt a pang in his chest. Suddenly, a terrifying idea crossed his mind. "What is it that you really want, Jessica?" His voice came out harder than he expected. She smiled smugly and finished her glass of wine. "I want you to stop lamenting like an idiot." Michael shook his head. "I can't do that, Jessica." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "Then we have a problem." A thick silence fell in the room. Michael looked at her intensely, as if trying to decipher what was hidden behind her words, and then he understood. This wasn't an argument, it was an ultimatum. Jessica wasn't going to stay with a weak man. She wasn't going to stay with someone who carried the burden of past guilt, and if he continued to sink into remorse, she would leave. Michael felt his heart race. All his life, he had done what was expected of him. He had followed every step, every order, and now, after having committed the worst betrayal of his life, he realized he was completely alone, because Jessica never loved him, because his mother was no longer there. Michael felt desperation squeeze his chest, but Jessica just smiled and walked away calmly, as if the conversation hadn't meant anything. "Take a shower, Michael. I don't want you getting into bed smelling like the office." And with that, she left him there, with the certainty that something inside him had changed forever. The morning air entered softly through the half-open window, mixing with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Mary opened her eyes slowly, feeling the warmth of the sheets and the softness of the mattress beneath her body. For an instant, she allowed herself to forget where she was, but then reality hit her like lightning. She wasn't in her house. She didn't have a house. She had been abandoned in the desert by her own son, and now she was in the home of two strangers who had saved her life. She sighed, closing her eyes tightly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her open them again. The door opened slightly, and Sophie appeared with her usual smile and a cup of coffee in her hands. "Good morning, Mary. How do you feel today?" Mary sat up with difficulty, her muscles still aching from the exhaustion of the past days. "Better. Thank you for everything." Sophie extended the cup of coffee to her. Mary took it with trembling hands, feeling the comforting warmth between her fingers. "Ernest went to the store early, but he said if you feel strong enough, we could go later so you can see it." Mary lowered her gaze, stirring the coffee with the spoon. "I don't want to be a burden to you." Sophie sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand sweetly. "And you're not. But if you need something to keep your mind occupied, the store could help you." Mary remained silent. All her life had been dedicated to her home, to her son, to a family that ended up betraying her. Before her was an opportunity she never imagined, a new beginning. But could she really start anew? She took a sip of coffee and looked at Sophie timidly. "Do you really think I could be useful in the store?" Sophie gave her a pat on the hand. "Mary, the best hands are those that have worked all their life out of love." Those words made Mary's chest tighten. She stared at the coffee cup for a few more moments, and then, with a firm voice, she said, "All right, I want to try." Sophie smiled tenderly. "Then let's finish breakfast and go." The sun shone strongly when Mary and Sophie arrived at the store. From outside, the small business looked modest, with a weathered wooden sign and shelves visible through the shop window. But as soon as she crossed the door, Mary saw something she didn't expect: a home. The shelves were full of basic products: rice, beans, sugar, coffee, bread, canned goods. Ernest was behind the counter attending to an elderly lady who was buying bread and eggs. When he saw her, he smiled. "Ah, good that you came. Mary, welcome to our second home." Mary felt a slight warmth rise in her chest. "It's a very nice place." "It's not much, but it gives us enough to live on," said Ernest with pride. Mary scanned every corner of the store with her gaze. There was something about this small business that comforted her. All her life she had worked at home, taking care of her son, managing what little they had. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt she had something more than the emptiness of betrayal. "How can I help?" she asked with a determined voice. Sophie passed her a clean apron. "To start, you could help us with arranging the products." Mary took the apron and put it on with a knot in the back. Her hands felt strangely firm, as if they had suddenly found something to hold on to. Ernest explained to her how to organize the products, how to check the expiration dates, and how to operate the cash register. Mary listened attentively, feeling how bit by bit her mind was filling with something other than the pain of the past. During the following hours, she concentrated on her new job, greeting customers, arranging beans on their shelves, counting change with still clumsy but willing, to learn hands. And for the first time in days, she didn't think about Michael. When evening fell, Sophie approached her with a smile. "You did very well for your first day." Mary sighed, wiping her hands on the apron. "It feels good." Ernest appeared from the storeroom with a box in his hands. "It seems we're going to have to get used to seeing you here every day." Mary smiled shyly. "If you don't mind, I think I'd like to stay longer." Sophie embraced her affectionately. "This is your home, Mary. Stay as long as you want." Mary felt her eyes moisten. For the first time in a long time, she felt she belonged somewhere. But in the deepest part of her heart, a shadow still lurked, because although she tried to ignore it, she knew that at some point she would have to face her past. The afternoon sun filtered through the store window, projecting long shadows on the worn tile floor. Mary was finishing arranging the coffee jars on the shelf when a shiver ran down her spine. A week had passed since she began working with Ernest and Sophie, a week in which little by little she had regained strength in her body and calm in her mind. But there was something that wouldn't leave her in peace: the past. No matter how hard she tried to move forward, there were nights when she woke up startled, with the sensation that the desert sand still covered her. Other times, she dreamed of Michael, of his laughter as a child, of his small arms surrounding her when he was a defenseless child. But then the image changed, and she would see again his cold eyes, his back moving away as he left her abandoned. "Mary," Sophie's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She blinked and found herself facing her friend's concerned gaze. "I called you 3 times. Mary shook her head, trying to clear her mind. "I'm sorry, I got distracted." Sophie crossed her arms. "You've been like this all morning. Do you want to talk?" Mary hesitated. She didn't want to burden Sophie with her thoughts, but at the same time, she felt that if she kept everything inside, she would end up suffocating. She sighed and leaned on the counter. "I can't stop thinking about him." Sophie didn't need to ask who she was referring to. "It's normal. He was your son all your life, Mary." Mary swallowed hard. "But he's not the boy I raised anymore. I don't know at what point he became a man capable of doing me so much harm." Sophie took her hand sweetly. "Don't feel guilty for what he did. People make their own decisions, and he made the worst of all." Mary pressed her lips together, feeling a knot in her throat. "Sometimes I wonder if he feels any remorse, if he ever thinks of me." Sophie remained silent for a moment before responding. "Maybe yes, maybe no, but that shouldn't define what you'll do with your life now." Mary lowered her gaze. "I don't know how to move forward." Sophie squeezed her hand more firmly. "One day at a time, Mary." Mary sighed and nodded. The tinkling of the door's bell was heard. "Good afternoon," greeted Ernest as he entered with a sack of sugar on his shoulder. Mary hurried to help him, and in a matter of minutes, her conversation with Sophie took second place. But although her hands were busy, her mind remained trapped in the same question. Did Michael think of her? Michael drank the last sip of his whiskey before putting the glass on the table. The living room was in semi-darkness, with the curtains closed and the air heavy with alcohol and tobacco. He had been unable to sleep well for days, unable to concentrate at work. The weight of what he had done pursued him like a shadow impossible to ignore. He had tried to do what Jessica told him, to move on with his life, not to look back, but it was impossible because every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother. And not as he remembered her at home, cooking or laughing with him when he was a child. No, he saw her in the desert, alone, with a pleading look, with trembling hands. He saw her reflection in the rearview mirror of the car as he drove away. "Enough," he murmured, pressing his head with his hands. He stood up and walked, staggering, to the wine cellar in search of another bottle, but he found nothing. Frustrated, he slammed the door shut. Jessica entered the kitchen with her phone in her hand and a look of contempt. "Are you going to continue with this?" Michael frowned. "With what?" "With your show of guilt and misery?" Jessica asked, looking at him with disdain. Michael felt a pang of anger in his chest. "You have no idea how I feel." Jessica sighed with annoyance. "I already told you, get over it. We're not going to recover the time lost worrying about someone who's no longer here." Michael felt his blood freeze. "What did you say?" Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What you heard." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "How can you talk like that?" Jessica shrugged. "Because it's the truth. If she were alive, someone would have found her. We would have heard something." Michael felt his stomach turn. The idea that his mother might really be dead was something he couldn't handle. "Shut up," he murmured with a trembling voice. Jessica approached and put a hand on his face with a cruel smile. "You have 2 options, love. Either you continue drowning in this until it drives you crazy, or you move forward with me." Michael looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. It was an ultimatum. If he continued on this path of guilt and remorse, he would lose everything. But if he forgot, he could move forward with Jessica, with the life they had built together. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He had to make a decision. Michael woke up with a dry mouth and a sharp pain in his head. He brought a hand to his forehead, feeling the weight of the whiskey he had drunk the night before. On the living room table, there were still 2 dirty glasses and an almost empty bottle. He looked around and found himself amid the disorder he had been accumulating in his house. Clothes thrown on the sofa, dirty dishes in the kitchen, the ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Jessica wasn't there. For days, she had been spending more time outside the house than inside. She left without saying where she was going and returned at dawn, when he was already too tired or drunk to ask her anything. He rubbed his face with both hands and stood up with difficulty. He knew he had to pull himself together, but every time he tried, guilt came back to drown him. Mary, his mother. He had tried to convince himself that what they did was right, that leaving her in the desert was a necessary decision, but the weight in his chest belied it. Sometimes he found himself looking at the phone with the impulse to dial her number, but he remembered there was no one to answer, because he had condemned her to disappear. He forced himself to get up and get into the shower. The cold water woke him up a bit, but not enough to erase the feeling of emptiness that accompanied him. He dressed hurriedly and took his car keys. If there was something that could distract him, it was work. But when he arrived at the office, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The hallways were quieter than normal. The looks from his colleagues were evasive. When he entered his office, his assistant was waiting for him with a worried expression. "Sir, Mr. Ortega wants to see you in his office." Michael frowned. "Ortega? For what?" The woman hesitated before responding. "I don't know, but it seems important." Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. He left his briefcase on the desk and walked with a firm step toward the director's office. When he entered, Ortega was sitting behind his enormous mahogany desk with his hands crossed and a serious expression on his face. "Sit down, Michael." Michael obeyed without saying anything. Ortega sighed before speaking. "I won't beat around the bush. The company has made the decision to make some cuts, and your position is among those that will be eliminated." Michael felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. "You're firing me?" Ortega looked at him with pity. "It's not personal. They're decisions from the board of directors." Michael clenched his fists. "I've worked here for years. And your performance in the last month has been concerning." Michael felt his blood boil. "You can't do this to me." Ortega shook his head. "It's already decided. You'll receive your severance next week." Michael was left speechless. He got up from the chair with a pale face. He had lost his job, his stability, all because of the guilt that was eating him from within. He left the office without saying goodbye to anyone. When he arrived home, he found Jessica in the living room, talking on the phone and laughing as if nothing mattered. When she saw him, her expression changed. "So, how did it go? Did they fire you?" Michael glared at her. "How do you know?" Jessica smiled coldly. "I know everything, Michael. You went from being successful to now having a loser in my living room." Michael stared at her. "Loser?" "Yes, Michael. You've become a burden." Jessica's words were a direct blow to his pride. But what hurt him most wasn't what she said, but the certainty that she really saw him that way, as an encumbrance, just as he had seen his mother. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was to be abandoned, and the desperation of knowing it was too late to fix what he had done. Michael remained silent after hearing Jessica's words. Something inside him broke, but not in the way he expected. Until that moment, he had always been afraid of losing her, afraid she would see him as someone weak, as a man who couldn't give her the life she deserved. But for the first time, he wondered if it was really worth continuing with her. Jessica gave him one last look of contempt before taking her purse and leaving the house without saying goodbye. The door closed with a dry bang, leaving behind an unbearable silence. Michael collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. He had lost his job. Jessica no longer saw him as a man worthy of her attention. And his mother continued to be a shadow in his conscience, a ghost that tormented him every night. He ran a hand over his face and took his phone. Without thinking too much, he opened his bank account. His eyes scanned the screen, and his stomach turned. The money in his account was no longer enough to maintain the life he had with Jessica. He bit his lip and forced himself to think. He could look for another job, But what company would hire him now? He had been acting like a ghost in the office for weeks before being fired. His reputation was tarnished. He needed money quickly. It was then that an idea crossed his mind. He got up from the sofa and walked to his bedroom. He opened the closet and took out a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were several expensive pieces of jewelry that his mother had kept preciously when he was a child. Michael remembered the last time Mary had shown him those jewels. "These belong to your grandmother," she had told him sweetly. "They're the only valuable things we have left." They were family heirlooms, something his mother would never have sold, no matter how difficult things got. But he didn't have that kind of scruples. He took the pieces of gold and put them in a small bag. He left the house without thinking too much, without stopping to consider what he was doing. He knew there was a pawn shop a few blocks ahead. He walked with the bag in his hand, feeling the weight of his decision with each step. When he arrived, the place was almost empty. A man with a gray beard looked at him from the other side of the counter. "What do you have?" he asked with a raspy voice. Michael opened the bag and let the jewels fall onto the glass. The man whistled. "Good pieces. Where did you get them from?" "It doesn't matter," responded Michael impatiently. "How much will you give me for them?" The man inspected them carefully. "I could offer you $20,000. Michael gritted his teeth. "That's worth much more." The man shrugged. "If you want more, find yourself another place." Michael hesitated, but he didn't have time to haggle. "Fine." The man took out a wad of bills and handed them to him. Michael took them with trembling hands. He had sold his mother's jewels, the only valuable pieces that Mary had protected all her life. When he left the pawn shop, he felt the air leave him. He couldn't sink any lower. Or could he? He breathed deeply and walked back home, but when he arrived, Jessica was already waiting for him in the living room with her arms crossed. "Where were you?" she asked with suspicion. Michael dropped the money on the table. "Here you have it, Jessica." He had reached the point of no return, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if he still had time to change his destiny. The light of dawn entered timidly through the window, bathing the room with a warm glow. Mary woke up feeling a strange sensation of peace, one she didn't remember having felt in a long time. She stayed in bed for a few seconds, enjoying the sound of the wind brushing against the curtains and the distant murmur of the street. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wake up with her heart constricted by sadness. She got up calmly, fixed the bed carefully, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection returned the image of a different woman. There were still shadows of fatigue on her face, but her eyes were no longer empty. She dressed in a simple blouse and a long skirt, pulled her hair back in a bun, and left the room with firm steps. In the kitchen, Sophie was already preparing coffee. "Good morning," she greeted with a smile. Mary returned the smile. "Good morning." "Ernest went to the store early to arrange the merchandise, but he said he's waiting for you to open." Mary nodded, taking a cup of hot coffee between her hands. "I'm glad. I want to work." Sophie observed her attentively. "You look different today." Mary blew softly on the surface of the coffee before responding. "I think for the first time I'm accepting that my life changed." Sophie smiled tenderly. "That's the first step." When Mary arrived at the store, Ernest was already behind the counter, counting bills and checking the cash register. "Good morning, Mary," he greeted without looking up. "Good morning, Ernest. What do we have for today?" Ernest closed the drawer and turned to her with a smile. "New bags of beans and sugar arrived. If you can arrange them on the shelves, I'd appreciate it." Mary nodded and got to work. As she worked, she realized how much she enjoyed the routine of the store. There was something comforting in arranging products, in seeing customers come and go, in hearing the morning greetings from the neighborhood people. Each day, she felt a little more part of something. In mid-morning, an elderly lady with gray hair and a flowered dress entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Mary," she greeted with kindness. Mary blinked, surprised. "How do you know my name?" The woman smiled. "Everyone here talks about you. They say Ernest and Sophie saved you and that now you're part of the store." Mary felt a slight warmth in her chest. "They've treated me with great kindness. They're good people." The woman took a package of bread and placed it on the counter. "And you seem to be too." Mary didn't know how to respond. Before, her life had revolved around being Michael's mother, around existing only for him. But now, for the first time, she felt she was something more than that. "I'm glad to see you well, Mrs. Mary," said the woman before paying and leaving the store. Mary remained silent for a few seconds. She felt strong, alive, capable of moving forward. But just when she thought her past was being left behind, a conversation in the store shook her completely. "Did you hear what happened to Mr. Michael?" murmured a man near the counter. Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. Ernest, who was attending, looked up with curiosity. "Michael, the businessman?" "Yes, they fired him. They say they let him go a few days ago." Mary's heart began to beat forcefully. "And his wife?" asked Ernest. The man made a gesture with his hand. "She left. She wasn't going to stay with a bankrupt man." Mary felt her body tense. Michael was alone, ruined, abandoned. For an instant, she didn't know what to feel. Did he deserve her pity, or was it simply the consequence of his own decisions? She breathed deeply and tried to concentrate on what she was doing, but an idea planted itself in her mind like a seed impossible to uproot. Michael was suffering, just as she had suffered. Did that mean she should forgive him, or did it mean that destiny was doing justice? She didn't have the answer, but deep down, she knew she would soon have to face it. Michael woke up with a strange sensation in his chest. Something was wrong. A heavy silence filled the house, one different from what he had endured in recent weeks. He rubbed his face with his hands before getting up. He looked around. His bedroom was disordered, with wrinkled clothes on the chair, empty bottles on the floor, and the curtains closed, preventing the sunlight from illuminating the mess his life had become. But there was something else, an emptiness, something that hadn't been there before. With a strange feeling of unease, he got up and left the room. He walked barefoot down the hallway, his heart beating hard. When he reached the living room, his breathing stopped. Next to the door, neatly aligned, were 3 large suitcases. He blinked several times, trying to process what he was seeing. He didn't need to ask who they belonged to. He knew immediately. Jessica was leaving. For some reason, seeing it with his own eyes hurt more than he had imagined. It wasn't that he hadn't expected it. He had felt the detachment in her voice, in her gaze, in the coldness with which she had treated him since he lost his job. But seeing her packing her life in a few suitcases made reality lodge in his chest like a knife. He heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. Jessica came out with her phone in hand, typing a message with indifference. She didn't even flinch when she saw him standing there, staring at her luggage. "You're leaving?" he asked with a hoarse voice. Jessica didn't even look up from her phone. "Yes." Michael gritted his teeth. "And you were going to leave without telling me anything?" She sighed as if the conversation was tedious to her. It wasn't worth the argument. Michael felt something break inside him. "Jessica, we've been together for years, and this is how everything ends?" She finally raised her gaze. That's how things end when a person stops being useful to the other. Michael felt his stomach turn. "I can't believe what you're saying." Jessica put the phone on the table and crossed her arms. "I don't know why you're surprised. You always knew who I was. I never lied to you about what I wanted in life." Michael shook his head. "I thought what we had was real." Jessica let out a cold laugh. "It was, while it suited me." Michael felt a knot in his throat. "What are you saying?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "Look, Michael, you gave me what I needed when it suited me. A good house, stability, comfort. But now you're a ruined man, without a job and without a future. And what does that mean?" She looked at him with disdain. "That you no longer have anything to offer me." Michael felt anger rising through his body like fire. "I can't believe you're so cynical." She shrugged. "It's not cynicism, it's realism." Michael closed his fists. "That easy? You get rid of me just like that?" "That easy. You got rid of your mother." The words hit him like a bucket of ice water. The entire world seemed to stop. Jessica looked at him steadily with a slight smile on her lips. "Or what did you think? That I was going to stay with you after seeing you consumed by guilt all these months?" Her voice became harder. You can't even stand yourself." Michael felt his body tremble. "Is that what you think?" Jessica took her purse and hung it over her shoulder. "It's what I always thought. But while you were useful to me, I didn't say it out loud." Michael felt the air leave him. "Did it mean nothing to you?" Jessica looked at him with something resembling pity. "Don't be ridiculous. Relationships are an exchange. When you stop giving me what I want, it ends." He remained silent, feeling that rage, sadness, and hatred mixed in his chest in a whirlwind impossible to contain. "Leave," he said. Jessica smiled with satisfaction. "That's what I was planning to do." She took the suitcases and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "Don't look for me, Michael. You don't need me, and I don't need you either." And with those words, she left. Michael stood there, watching the door close behind her. The silence that remained in the house was deafening. He collapsed onto the sofa with his head in his hands. He had lost everything: his mother, his job, his wife. The house that once seemed like his refuge now felt like an empty cage. Was this what he deserved? Was this the punishment for what he had done? He had no answers, but something inside him told him this was just the beginning of his true fall. The silence in the house was suffocating. Michael stood in the middle of the living room with his gaze fixed on the door through which Jessica had just left. She had gone, had left him without looking back, without a single word of farewell that sounded sincere. He had believed it would hurt more, but the only thing he felt at that moment was an icy emptiness in his chest. With slow steps, he walked to the sofa and collapsed heavily. He passed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven beard. Around him, the house seemed different. It was no longer the home he had built with Jessica. It was just an empty structure. He took a bottle of whiskey from the table and poured a shot into a glass. He sat staring at the golden liquid with a blank mind. He had everything: money, a stable marriage, or so he thought, a life of comfort. Now he had nothing. Jessica had abandoned him the moment he ceased to be useful to her. The job that gave him prestige and stability had been taken from him, and the worst was that his mother was no longer there. A shiver ran down his spine. Since he left her in the desert, he had tried to avoid thinking about her, to convince himself that what he did was necessary. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, her pleading gaze, the trembling of her hands, the sound of her voice breaking when she asked him why. Michael swallowed hard and took a sip of whiskey, feeling the burning in his throat. It did him no good to lament. What was done was done. He got up from the sofa and walked to his bedroom. The bed still had Jessica's perfume on it, a cruel reminder that until a few hours ago, his life still had some stability. But she had taken everything she could carry: clothes, jewelry, even the cash savings they kept in the safe. He stood looking at the open closet, now half empty, and let out a bitter laugh. So this is what it feels like to be abandoned. The words floated in the air, as if someone else had said them. He collapsed onto the bed and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he understood what his mother must have felt when he left her alone in the middle of the desert. Helplessness, desolation, fear. The difference was that he was in his house, with a roof, with food, with whiskey to numb the pain. His mother had none of that, just sand and the suffocating heat of the sun. Michael felt a knot in his throat. He didn't know if she was alive or dead, and the worst part was that he was afraid to find out. Days passed slowly and heavily. Michael stopped leaving the house. Bills began to accumulate. The refrigerator was almost empty. He no longer had money. The little cash Jessica hadn't taken had gone to alcohol and cigarettes. He felt trapped in a cycle of self-destruction from which he couldn't escape. He stayed awake until dawn, drinking and smoking. He woke up late with a throbbing head and a dry mouth. Time became a blurry concept. He didn't know if it was Monday or Saturday. All he did was remember his mother's words, her laughter when he was a child, her tenderness when caring for him when he fell ill, and the last image he had of her, standing in the desert, watching as he drove away. Michael gritted his teeth and threw the glass against the wall. The crystal shattered, scattering across the floor. He breathed agitatedly, with closed fists. He couldn't continue like this. He couldn't live with this guilt. He got up and staggered to the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize himself. Deep dark circles, pale skin, eyes reddened by alcohol and insomnia. He gripped the sink forcefully. He couldn't continue to sink. Not like this. He needed to do something. He needed answers. He needed to know if his mother, if Mary, was still alive. Michael looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man who returned his gaze. Deep dark circles, pale skin, and chapped lips. He seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few weeks. He turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on his face, but neither the water nor the air entering through the window could alleviate the feeling of oppression in his chest. He had no job, no money, no Jessica, and worst of all, he didn't have his mother. He stood in front of the mirror, breathing heavily, with water dripping from his chin. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind like a sharp dagger. What if Mary was dead? The air caught in his throat. Since he abandoned her in the desert, he had never dared to find out what had happened to her. He had lived in denial, pretending his life could move forward, but the truth was that his life had crumbled the moment he left her behind. He moved away from the mirror and left the bathroom with heavy steps. He walked through the empty house, feeling that every corner was judging him. His mother had been here, sitting on this same sofa, preparing food in this same kitchen, calling him son with love, and he had condemned her. He sat on the edge of the bed and took his phone. He could search for her name on the internet, in some news, but the fear of finding the worst paralyzed him. He spent several minutes looking at the screen without daring to do anything, until he finally made a decision. He stood up abruptly and left the house. He needed answers. Hours later, Michael was sitting at a table in the cafe where he used to go when he still had a job. He had spent all afternoon asking in hospitals, in shelters, even in police stations, but no one knew anything about Mary. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. He took a sip of cold coffee, feeling that desperation was beginning to take hold of him. She couldn't have disappeared without a trace. Michael looked up upon hearing his name. A man with graying hair and a serious gaze was observing him from the entrance of the cafe. Michael recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Anthony, an old friend of his mother. His stomach tightened. Anthony walked to his table and sat across from him without asking permission. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said with a firm voice. Michael swallowed hard. "I was just having coffee." Anthony looked at him steadily. "I haven't seen you for months, since Mary disappeared." The air suddenly became dense. Michael shifted in his seat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Anthony rested his elbows on the table. "Don't play dumb, Michael. Everyone knows you threw her out of your house." Michael felt a knot in his throat. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me where Mary is." Michael felt the weight of guilt crushing him. "I don't know." Anthony tightened his lips with an expression of contempt. "If something happened to Mary, it will be your fault." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Anthony stood up and gave him one last hard look. "I hope you can live with yourself." And without saying more, he left. Michael remained alone at the table with trembling hands. No, he couldn't live with himself, not like this. He stood up with a single thought in mind. He had to find his mother, no matter what. Michael left the cafe with trembling hands and his mind in a whirlwind. Anthony's words continued to resonate in his head. If something happened to Mary, it will be your fault. He couldn't continue to evade his past spent months drowning in his misery, blaming destiny, lamenting having lost everything. But now he understood that the only thing that mattered was knowing if his mother was alive, and if she was, what would he do about it? He stopped on the sidewalk, breathing with difficulty. He thought of returning to his house, hiding among bottles of alcohol, and postponing the search until the weight of guilt consumed him completely. But he couldn't allow himself more cowardice. He took out his phone with trembling fingers, looked for Mary's contact, and called. The tone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then the automatic message, "The number you dialed is not available." Michael closed his eyes in frustration. He ran a hand through his hair and tried to think clearly. If his mother was alive, Someone must know something. The last time he saw her was in the desert, but he couldn't go back there. It wouldn't serve any purpose. So where to look? Hospitals, shelters, places where they helped vulnerable people. Maybe, just maybe, someone had found her and taken her to a safe place. It was a remote possibility, but it was all he had. He breathed deeply and began to walk, determined to find her. He spent the next few hours touring the city. He went to hospitals, asked at the reception if there were records of an elderly woman who had been admitted in recent months. Nothing. He visited shelters for homeless people, described his mother, asked if anyone had seen her. Nothing. He tried with the police, with social assistance centers. No one had information. Each negative response was another blow to his already worn-out hope. He walked through the city like a lost man, feeling that with each step, the possibility of finding Mary vanished more. Finally, when the sun began to set, his steps led him to a small church in the center of Phoenix. He stopped in front of the wooden doors without knowing why he had ended up there. Maybe because deep down, he needed a miracle. He entered in silence and found himself in a calm environment. The light of candles flickered on the altars, and a few people prayed in the pews. He walked to the back of the church and collapsed onto an empty bench. For the first time in a long time, he felt he didn't have the strength. He rested his elbows on his knees and covered his face with his hands. He didn't know how to pray. He had never been a man of faith. But at that moment, he murmured in a low voice, "I just want to know if she's alive." The sound of soft footsteps made him look up. A priest with graying hair approached with a kind smile. "Good afternoon, son. Do you need help?" Michael swallowed hard. "I'm looking for someone." The priest sat beside him. "Who are you looking for?" Michael closed his eyes for a moment before responding. "My mother." The priest looked at him attentively. "What's her name?" "Mary." There was a brief silence. Then the priest narrowed his eyes as if trying to remember something. "Mary?" Michael felt his heart beating strongly. "Do you know her?" The priest didn't respond immediately. He remained thoughtful before slowly nodding. "I don't know her directly, but I think I know who you're talking about." Michael felt the air catch in his throat. "Where is she?" The priest stood up. "Come with me." Michael followed him with his nerves destroying his stomach. They left the church and walked down a narrow street until they reached a small community dining hall. The priest pointed to the entrance. "Here we help people in need. A few months ago, a man who works with us told me about an older woman who arrived in very bad shape, dehydrated, and with wounds on her feet." Michael felt his legs tremble. "Was it her?" The priest sighed. "I don't know with certainty, but if Mary was on the street, there's a great possibility that someone here knows something about her." Michael clenched his fists. "I need to see her." The priest looked at him calmly. "First, you need to prepare yourself." Michael frowned. "Prepare myself for what?" The priest put a hand on his shoulder. "For the possibility that she may not want to see you." Michael felt the ground open beneath his feet. He hadn't thought about that. If Mary was alive, if he had really found her, what would happen if she didn't want to know anything about him? He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. It didn't matter. He had to see her, had to try, because if he didn't, he would never be able to forgive himself. "I'm ready," he murmured. The priest nodded and guided him to the entrance. Michael crossed the door with his heart in his throat, and at that moment, his life changed forever. Michael crossed the door of the community dining hall with his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he expected to find on the other side. He only knew that after so much time living in denial, he was finally facing the only truth that really mattered, if his mother was alive. The priest guided him down a narrow hallway with worn walls. On the sides were tables with people seated, some eating, others simply resting. A couple of volunteers cleaned dishes, and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Michael felt a knot in his throat. He had spent months sinking into his own misery, drowning in alcohol and guilt, while his mother could have been in a place like this. "Brother Andrew," called the priest to a tall man with graying hair who was organizing boxes of food. The man turned and smiled upon seeing them. "Father, what a pleasure to see you." "Andrew, this young man is looking for someone." The man looked at him with curiosity. "Who are you looking for?" Michael felt his stomach tighten. "My mother. Her name is Mary." Andrew narrowed his eyes as if trying to remember. "Mary?" Michael nodded impatiently. "Yes, she was missing for months." Andrew frowned and crossed his arms. "I think I know who you're talking about." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "Where is she?" Andrew sighed. "I don't know with certainty, but I remember that a few months ago they brought an older woman here in very bad shape." The world of Michael seemed to stop. "Was it her?" Andrew tilted his head. "I don't know her name. She could barely speak when they found her. She was dehydrated, injured. They said she had been left in the desert." Michael felt the air leave him. It was her. It was Mary. There was no doubt. Andrew continued. "She was here for a couple of days, but then a family took her away." Michael narrowed his eyes. "What family?" "I don't know with certainty. I just remember it was an older couple. They seemed like good people." Michael felt his pulse accelerate. "Did they say where they would take her?" Andrew shook his head. "They just said they would take care of her." Michael ran a hand over his face. After so much time without knowing anything about his mother, he finally had a lead. She was alive, and somewhere, someone had helped her. He turned to the priest with his eyes lit by a new determination. "I need to find her." The priest put a hand on his shoulder. "Have patience, son. If your mother survived, sooner or later you will find her." Michael nodded, but inside him, impatience burned. He couldn't wait. Not now, not after everything he had done. Michael crossed the entrance of the community dining hall with his heart pounding in his chest. His breathing was heavy, and he felt as if the air inside the place was denser, more difficult to inhale. He ran a hand over his face, trying to calm himself. He had searched for days, asking, walking, visiting every shelter, every hospital, every corner where someone might give him information about Mary, and now, for the first time, he was close. The priest took him to a small office at the back of the dining hall, where boxes of donated food and clothing were stored. Andrew, the volunteer who had given him the first clue about Mary, was already waiting for him, reviewing some sheets. "I spoke with some people who have been working here for months," said Andrew, "and the woman they brought was Mary." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. "Where is she?" Andrew left the sheets on the table and looked at him calmly. "The family that took her is called Ernest and Sophie." Michael frowned. "Ernest and Sophie?" The name didn't tell him anything. Andrew nodded. "They're a couple who run a small store in Phoenix. Mary was here for a few days, but they decided to take care of her and take her with them." Michael felt the ground shake beneath his feet. His mother was alive, and not only that, she had found a new home. A pang of emotion, fear, and anxiety hit him full force. "I need to see her," he said with a firm voice. Andrew crossed his arms. "Michael, before you go, I want you to understand something." Michael swallowed hard. "What?" "Mary is not the same woman you left in the desert." Michael felt his stomach turn. "What do you mean?" Andrew sighed. "When she arrived here, she was broken, but she found in Ernest and Sophie a refuge, a family." Michael clenched his fists. "I am her family." Andrew looked at him seriously. "Are you sure she sees you the same way?" Michael felt the impact of those words was stronger than anything else. He had never considered that possibility that his mother might no longer see him as her son, that he might no longer have a place in her life. Fear settled in his chest like an unbearable weight. But he could no longer retreat, not after having come so far. He turned to the priest. "Tell me where the store is." The priest looked at him with compassion and nodded. "I'll take you." Michael breathed deeply and followed him. With each step he took, he felt his life was about to change forever. The car advanced slowly through the streets of Phoenix. Each meter it traveled felt like an eternity for Michael, seated in the passenger seat with sweaty hands on his legs. He looked out the window with his stomach in knots. The priest drove in silence, giving him space to assimilate what he was about to do. "Are you sure about this, Michael?" asked the man without taking his eyes off the road. Michael swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "Yes, I have to see her." The priest sighed, and turned onto a narrow street where small local businesses filled the sidewalks with boxes of fruit, water jugs, and signs worn by the sun. "There's the store," he finally said. Michael looked up, and his heart stopped for a moment. It was a modest business with a wooden sign hanging over the entrance. Through the glass of the door, the shelves full of basic products and the counter where an older man arranged some bags of rice could be seen. But the only thing Michael saw was her. Mary was at the back of the store with an apron tied around her waist, taking packages of coffee out of a cardboard box. Michael felt the air leave him. His mother was alive. Not only that, she looked well, much better than he remembered. This wasn't the fragile and submissive woman he had left behind. This wasn't the desperate mother who pleaded in the desert. This Mary had her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her movements were firm and sure. She was standing, working, living without him. Michael felt a pang of pain in his chest. The priest observed him cautiously. "Michael, listen to me. You don't know how she's going to react." Michael nodded, still with his gaze fixed on his mother. "I know. Maybe she doesn't want to see you." Michael felt his throat tighten. "I know that too." The priest sighed. "Then go calmly." Michael nodded once more and opened the car door. Each step he took toward the store felt as if he were walking on glass. When he was in front of the entrance, he breathed deeply and put his hand on the doorknob. The door opened with a slight tinkling of the bell, and Mary, distracted with her work, didn't turn immediately, but Ernest did. The man who was arranging products near the counter looked up and frowned upon seeing him. "How can I help you?" he asked in a dry tone. Michael felt his legs tremble. "I'm looking for Mary." At that moment, his mother raised her head. Her gaze crossed with Michael's. Time seemed to stop. Mary's eyes opened slightly, but there was no surprise, no emotion, just a cold and contained expression. Michael felt the weight of guilt fall on him with all its force. He didn't know what he expected, that she would run to embrace him, that she would look at him with love as if nothing had happened. None of that happened. Mary left the coffee package on the table and slowly removed her apron. "Sophie, I'll handle this," she said with a firm voice. The woman who was arranging cans on the other end of the store looked at Ernest with concern but nodded. Mary walked to the door, passed beside Michael without looking at him, and went outside. Michael took a few seconds to react. Ernest observed him harshly. "Don't follow her, if you're not prepared to hear the truth." Michael swallowed hard. "I have to do it." He left the store and found his mother standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the horizon. He approached with hesitant steps. "Mom?" Mary closed her eyes for a moment, breathed deeply, and then looked at him. "Don't call me that." Michael felt the world collapse around him. "Mom, I'm not your mother." Mary's words were a dagger straight to the heart. "Don't say that." The words were a plea. "I say it because it's the truth." Her tone was serene but sharp, like a knife. "A son doesn't do what you did." Michael felt his throat close. "You don't know how much I regret it." Mary let out a bitter laugh. "And what do you want me to do with your regret?" Michael lowered his gaze. "I just want you to listen to me." Mary observed him in silence for a moment. Then, with a coldness that Michael had never seen in her, she said, "You have 5 minutes." Michael felt the air fail him. 5 minutes to explain to his mother why he had condemned her. 5 minutes to try to repair the irreparable. 5 minutes to decide if he had any chance of recovering what he had lost. Michael felt the air become denser around him. His mother was in front of him with her arms crossed and a cold gaze. He had spent months imagining this moment, rehearsing in his mind what he would say to her if he ever found her. But now that he had her in front of him, his words tangled in his throat. 5 minutes was all Mary had granted him. 5 minutes to try to explain himself. 5 minutes to do the impossible. Ask forgiveness for something unforgivable. "Mom," he began, but Mary glared at him. "I told you not to call me that." Michael swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Mary raised an eyebrow with an almost mocking expression. "Is that all you have to say?" Michael breathed deeply. "Number, I just don't know where to start." Mary looked at him harshly. "Start with the truth." Michael lowered his gaze for a moment. He knew he couldn't justify what he did, but he couldn't remain silent either. "I let myself be carried away by fear," he said with a tense voice. "By pressure. Jessica convinced me that you were a burden, that we couldn't live our life in peace." Mary let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you think I was to you? A burden?" Michael quickly shook his head. "No, Mom, I never saw it that way. But I did it. I don't know at what moment I became that man." He continued, his voice trembling. "I don't know how I was capable of doing something so terrible. But every day, every night, I've lived with the weight of my guilt." Mary observed him with pressed lips. "And what do you expect me to do with your guilt, Michael?" Michael felt a knot in his throat. "I don't know. I just want you to know that I regret it, that if I could go back in time, I would do anything to avoid it." Mary frowned her lips and looked away for an instant, as if she were debating between what she felt and what she should do. "You can't go back in time," she finally said. Michael nodded. "I know." There was a thick silence between them. Mary breathed deeply, closing her eyes for a second. "For months," she said with a low but firm voice, "I thought I was going to die there. I felt the heat burning my skin, the thirst drying my throat, my body weakening bit by bit. And at every moment, the only thing I thought was, my son left me here." Michael closed his eyes, feeling that his mother had just given him the final sentence. "I thought of you every day, Michael. I thought of the child I raised with love, of the man you became. I wondered if you had ever regretted it, if you had even looked back after abandoning me." Michael felt his hands tremble. "I did." Mary looked at him intently. "But you didn't come back." Michael had no response for that. "I didn't know how to do it. I got lost. I lost my job. Jessica left me. My life crumbled, and still the only thing that mattered was finding my mother." Mary let out a deep sigh, but her expression remained indecipherable. "And what do you expect from me now?" Michael felt small. "I just want you to forgive me." Mary looked at him in silence for long seconds. "Will forgiveness erase what you did? Will it make the pain disappear?" "Number. Then tell me, Michael, why should I forgive you?" Michael felt desperation squeeze his chest. "Because I love you. Because you're my mother." Mary narrowed her eyes. "Do you realize how ironic that sounds?" Michael lowered his head. "I know, but it's the truth." Mary sighed and crossed her arms. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Michael." Michael felt his stomach drop. "Mom, don't say that." She interrupted him firmly. "You made a decision when you left me in that desert. I also had to make a decision after that, and I chose to live without you." Michael felt hope escaping like sand between his fingers. "Don't say that." Mary looked at him with a coldness he had never seen in her before. "You're right about one thing," she said slowly. "I am your mother, and I loved you more than anything in this world." Michael held his breath. "But that doesn't mean I have to return to my life as if nothing had happened." Michael felt the blow in his chest. His mother didn't hate him, but she wasn't willing to accept him back so easily either. "Your time is up, Michael," Mary said with a firm voice. "Return to your life. I already have mine." Michael looked at her with eyes full of plea. "Mom." But Mary was already entering the store again. The door closed behind her, leaving Michael alone on the street with his soul in pieces. He hadn't completely rejected him, but he hadn't forgiven him either. And now, more than ever, he knew that if he wanted to recover his mother, he would have to prove he had changed. Michael stood in front of the store, feeling how the door recently closed by Mary completely isolated him from her world. For the first time in his life, his mother had pushed him away in a definitive way. She was no longer his mother. She no longer called him son. He himself had turned her into a stranger. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find strength where he had none. Desperation clouded his mind, but he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. He slowly turned his head and saw through the glass of the store Mary was back at the counter, continuing with her work as if he had never been there, as if his presence meant nothing. Michael felt his chest compress. But before he could move, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching behind him. He turned and found Ernest with his arms crossed, looking at him with a serious expression. "Are you finished?" Michael swallowed hard. I don't know. Ernest narrowed his eyes. Don't pressure her. Michael clenched his fists. I'm not here to pressure her. I just want to see her. Ernest sighed and lowered his arms. Let's talk. Michael followed him without protesting. Ernest walked to the back of the store, where there was a small patio with a couple of old metal chairs. He sat in one and pointed to the other for Michael to do the same. Michael collapsed into the chair with slumped shoulders. I didn't expect her to receive me with open arms, he murmured. Ernest let out a dry laugh. Really, Michael? Michael rubbed his face with his hands. I don't know what I expected. Ernest observed him calmly. Mary is a strong woman, but she's also a wounded woman. When she arrived here, she wasn't just physically destroyed. She also had a broken soul. Michael felt a pang in his chest. How did you find her? Almost dead, Ernest responded without beating around the bush, dehydrated with her feet in raw flesh with fever. Michael felt the air fail him. I didn't know she had gotten to that point. Of course you didn't know, Ernest looked at him harshly, because you didn't even bother to find out. Michael felt the weight of his words like a blow to the stomach. I didn't dare, he admitted with a trembling voice. I was afraid of what I might find. Ernest sighed and looked at him for a few seconds before speaking. You can't force her to forgive you. Michael pressed his lips together. I know. And are you prepared to accept that? Michael looked at the store from the patio. Through the glass, Mary continued with her work. His mother was alive, but living a life in which he had no place. The thought hit him hard. I'll do whatever is necessary to prove to her that I'm not the same man who left her behind. Ernest watched him attentively, evaluating him. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. Very well, Michael. Then start from scratch. Michael frowned. From scratch? Ernest nodded. If you really want to prove that you've changed, don't do it with words, do it with actions. Michael felt his heart beating forcefully. How? Ernest got up and looked at him seriously. Tomorrow morning, I want to see you here at 6 a.m. Michael raised an eyebrow. For what? Ernest smiled slightly. To work. Michael felt his stomach tighten. You want me to work in the store? Ernest crossed his arms. I don't want anything. It's your decision. But if you really want to be close to Mary, you'd better start earning your place. Michael breathed deeply. He didn't know if this would bring him closer to his mother. He didn't know if it would work. But for the first time in his life, he understood that if he wanted a chance to repair what he had done, he would have to start from the bottom, from where Mary had started again without him. I'll be here, he said firmly. Ernest looked at him one last time, nodded, and turned to go back to the store. Michael remained seated for a moment longer, watching the door that separated him from his mother. Tomorrow would be the first day of his test, the first day of his true repentance, and he didn't plan to fail. Michael didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small apartment looking at the ceiling, his mind spinning in circles. Mary had rejected him not completely, but enough to make it clear that if he wanted to regain his place in her life, he would have to prove it with something more than words. He didn't know how to do it. He didn't know if he even had the right to try. But he did know one thing. He couldn't give up. When the clock showed 5:30 a.m., he got up and prepared to leave. He put on a simple shirt, worn jeans, and the only decent shoes he had left. At 5:55, he was already in front of Ernest and Sophie's store. The business was still closed. The streets were calm. Only the first rays of the sun illuminated the sidewalks. Michael ran a hand through his hair and breathed deeply. Perhaps Ernest was just testing him. Perhaps they wouldn't even open the door for him. But just when that thought crossed his mind, the metal curtain of the store began to rise. Ernest appeared at the entrance with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked at him with a raised eyebrow. I didn't think you'd actually come. Michael cleared his throat. I'm here, like you said. Ernest took a sip of coffee and nodded slowly. Good, then let's go inside. The first paycheck Michael received felt different from any money he had ever earned. It was small, barely enough to cover a week's groceries, but he held it with reverence. This was honest money, earned through sweat and effort. As he walked home that evening, he passed by a homeless man huddled in a doorway. Before, Michael would have hurried past, perhaps irritated by the interruption to his day. Now, he stopped, remembering what it meant to be vulnerable, to be at the mercy of others. "Sir," he said, extending half of his sandwich and some of his water, "please take this." The man looked up, surprised. "God bless you," he said quietly. Michael shook his head. "I'm just trying to do better," he replied, understanding for the first time that redemption wasn't found in grand gestures but in these small moments of humanity. In recognizing the dignity in others that he had once failed to see in his own mother. Michael followed him to the interior of the store, where the lights were still off and the aroma of stored products floated in the air. "The work here is simple," said Ernest, leaving his coffee on the counter. "But that doesn't mean it's easy. You have to lift boxes, arrange merchandise, attend to customers." Michael nodded, ready to accept any task. But Ernest wasn't finished. "It also means you'll see Mary every day." Michael swallowed hard. "I know. And are you prepared for that?" Michael didn't respond immediately. Was he? After everything he had done, after seeing her again and feeling the coldness in her gaze, could he bear to be near her without it destroying him from within? "Yes," he finally said with a firm voice. Ernest looked at him for a few seconds, then pointed to a pile of boxes in the back storage room. "Then start. Unload those boxes and arrange the products on the shelves." Michael nodded and got to work. The first hours of the morning passed, and Michael barely had a moment to breathe. He unloaded boxes, cleaned shelves, arranged products while Ernest supervised him in silence. By the time the store opened to the public, his shirt was already stuck to his back with sweat. He wasn't used to this type of work. All his life, he had comfortable jobs behind a desk with air conditioning and a computer. Now he was carrying sacks of flour, cleaning dust-off products, and learning to deal with customers who didn't even look him in the eye. But he didn't complain. He knew this was just the beginning. He knew this was the first test. When Mary entered the store, Michael felt that the air became heavier. She saw him, but didn't say anything. She just passed by him as if he were another stranger. Michael felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't react. He forced himself to continue working because this time it wasn't his words that would speak for him. It was his actions, his days of effort, his constancy, his patience. If he wanted Mary to give him a chance, he would have to show her that he was a different man. And although the path might be long and painful, he was willing to walk it. Michael woke up before his alarm sounded. He hadn't slept well, but that was no longer news. Since the day he began working at the store, his mind had given him no respite. He had spent the last nights remembering every word from his mother. "You can't go back in time. I chose to live without you." Mary had been clear. She didn't want him to be part of her life. But Michael couldn't accept it not when he saw her every day, so close yet so unreachable. He got up wearily, dressed in the same shirt as always, and left for the store. He knew today would be another difficult day, like all the previous ones. When he arrived, Ernest was already organizing the merchandise, and Mary was behind the counter, counting change in the cash register. "You're early," said Ernest without looking up. Michael nodded. "I'm ready to start." "Good. Then clean the shelves at the back and make sure the products are well arranged." Michael took a cloth and went to the back of the store. While cleaning, he heard the murmurs of customers coming and going. Sometimes he heard Mary's voice talking naturally, attending to people with kindness. But she never addressed him. It was as if Michael didn't exist, and that hurt him more than he wanted to admit. The hours passed, and the heat of the day intensified. The store was full of customers, and Michael worked in silence, without complaining, without expecting recognition. Then he heard Ernest's voice calling him. "Michael, come here." Michael left what he was doing and walked to the counter. Ernest handed him some coins. "Take this to Mr. Gutierrez. He said he was short on change. He's outside." Michael took the coins and left the store, looking for the man. But as soon as he went out into the street, he overheard something that made him stop in his tracks. "You look different, Mary." It was a woman's voice. Michael turned his head and saw Mary standing on the sidewalk, talking to an older lady. Curiosity forced him to remain still, listening. "I feel different, Karen," Mary responded in a calm tone. "Now I have peace." Michael felt his chest tighten, peace, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The lady smiled. "I'm glad to see you well. You deserve it." Mary nodded, and before saying goodbye, she said something that made Michael feel as if the ground were opening beneath his feet. "I finally learned to live without looking back." Michael felt his stomach turn. She was serious. Mary had really moved on without him. Michael clenched his fists and walked quickly to Mr. Gutierrez to give him the change, but his mind was elsewhere. When he returned to the store, he felt Mary looking at him for a brief instant. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was no love either, just indifference, and that was what was killing him inside. Michael understood something at that moment. Asking for forgiveness wasn't enough. Proving he had changed wasn't either. Mary no longer needed him, and if he wanted to be part of her life again, he would have to accept the possibility that she might not want the same thing. The days passed slowly for Michael. Each morning, before the sun appeared on the horizon, he arrived at the store ready to start his workday. He didn't speak with Mary. She didn't address him either. It was as if he were a shadow within the store, someone who was simply there but meant nothing. And yet, Michael didn't give up. He arranged the merchandise, attended to customers, cleaned the floor without expecting recognition. Every time Mary passed by him, Michael contained the need to speak to her, to explain, to beg for a second chance. But he knew that words no longer served. He knew that only his actions could demonstrate who he was now. One afternoon, while arranging products on the shelves, he heard Ernest's voice calling him from the storeroom. "Michael, come a moment." Michael left what he was doing and walked to the back of the store. Ernest was seated on an old wooden bench with an open box in front of him. "Help me with this," he said, pointing to the packages inside the box. Michael nodded and began to take out the products. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but Ernest observed him from the corner of his eye. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You've changed." Michael looked up, surprised. "You think so?" Ernest nodded slowly. "At first, I thought you were just here to clean your conscience. But you keep coming, you keep working, and you've never complained." Michael put down the package he had in his hands and sighed. "I can't complain, Ernest." Ernest crossed his arms. "Why not?" Michael looked at him steadily. "Because I have too much to repair." Ernest didn't respond immediately. He remained silent, as if evaluating every word. Finally, he nodded. "Mary still doesn't speak to you." Michael felt a knot in his throat. "I know. Doesn't that discourage you?" Michael lowered his gaze. "Before, yes. But now I understand that she has the right to move forward without me." Ernest narrowed his eyes. "And then why do you still come here?" Michael took a breath and let it out slowly. "Because even if she doesn't want me in her life, I want her to at least know that I'm a different man." Ernest observed his expression as if trying to decipher if his words were sincere. After a long silence, the man smiled slightly. "Maybe you're not the same Michael as before." Michael felt a pang of hope in his chest. Ernest stood up and gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Get back to work." Michael nodded and returned to the front of the store. When he passed by Mary, she didn't look at him, but for the first time, Michael noticed that her expression had changed. Maybe, just maybe, his mother had begun to see him in a different way, and that gave him strength to continue forward. The sound of the morning market filled the street in front of the store. The sun wasn't yet at its highest point, but the heat was already making itself felt. Michael swept the entrance to the business while the aroma of freshly baked bread floated in the air. He had been working there for weeks. He had gotten used to the routine, to the physical effort, to the sensation of building something from scratch. But what hadn't changed was Marish still didn't speak to him beyond what was strictly necessary. If their gazes ever crossed, she would look away first. Michael understood that he couldn't force her, but each day that passed without knowing if she would forgive him or not was torture. He sighed and continued with his work. Inside the store, Mary was arranging products when she felt someone watching her. She turned and saw Sophie standing there, looking at her with an expression that Mary knew well. "Say it?" murmured Mary without looking up. Sophie smiled. I haven't said anything. But you will. Sophie put down the box she had in her hands and crossed her arms. Mary, until when are you going to continue ignoring him? Mary pressed her lips together. I don't ignore him. You don't speak to him. I don't need to speak to him. Sophie sighed and sat on a nearby bench. He's been here every day without failing, without complaining. I know. He hasn't asked for anything. I know. Sophie tilted her head. So? Mary closed her eyes for a moment. It's not that easy, Sophie. No one said it was. Mary left what she was doing and leaned on the counter. He thinks that, by coming here and working hard, everything will be fixed. And it's not like that. Mary shook her head. I can't forget what he did. Sophie looked at her tenderly. It's not about forgetting, Mary. It's about deciding if you want to continue living with that resentment or if you want to let it go. Mary felt the weight of those words hit her forcefully. All her life, her love for Michael had been the most important thing, but that love had become a deep wound. And now he was there, waiting, without demanding, without pressuring, simply being. Mary breathed deeply. I don't know if I can forgive him. Sophie took her hand delicately. But you also don't know if you can't. Mary looked out the window. Michael was still outside, sweeping, with a serene face, not knowing that inside the store his fate was being decided. Mary felt her heart beating strongly. She had to make a decision because if she continued like this, she might lose her son forever. The day passed with the same routine as always in the store. Michael worked in silence, moving boxes, cleaning shelves, attending to customers. He had become accustomed to his new life, to the feeling of exhaustion in his muscles at the end of the day, to the rough hands from so much effort. But what hadn't changed was the distance between him and Mary. She still didn't speak to him more than necessary. She still passed by him without looking directly at him, as if he were still a stranger. Michael accepted it. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to force anything. He only waited. That night, when the store was about to close, he stayed arranging some papers at the counter. Sophie and Ernest were already in the back, organizing the day's cash. Michael remained at the entrance, wondering if he should say goodbye or simply leave in silence as he always did. But before he could decide, Mary spoke. Stay. Michael turned with his heart pounding in his chest. Mary wasn't looking at him. She was still focused on her papers, but her words were clear. Michael nodded and approached slowly. What's going on? Mary finished organizing the papers and finally looked at him. We need to talk. Michael felt the air become denser. I'm listening. Mary crossed her arms. I don't know what you expect from me. Michael swallowed hard. I don't expect anything. Mary narrowed her eyes. Don't lie. You've been coming here every day, working tirelessly, waiting for me to tell you at some point that I forgive you. Michael lowered his gaze. I wouldn't blame you if you never did. Mary sighed. It's not about forgiving or not, Michael. It's about what comes after. Michael frowned. What do you mean? Mary put her hands on the counter and looked at him firmly. What will you do with your life when this ends? Michael felt a knot in his throat. I don't know. Well, you should know. Mary didn't look away. You can't stay here forever. Michael felt fear churning his stomach. Are you telling me to leave? Mary shook her head. I'm telling you that you can't live just waiting for my forgiveness. Michael pressed his lips together. I don't want to distance myself from you again. And I don't want to see you waste your life for something I don't know if I can give you. The silence between them grew heavy. For the first time, Michael understood the true meaning of forgiveness. It wasn't just saying, I forgive you. It wasn't just receiving a hug and moving forward. It was a process. It was reconstruction. It was change. And above all, it was accepting that not everything could go back to being as it was before. Mary looked at him with a softer expression. If you want to prove to me that you've changed, don't do it here waiting for me to tell you everything is okay. Do it by rebuilding your own life. Michael felt the air fail him. You want me to leave? Mary breathed deeply. I want you to learn to live without depending on my forgiveness. Michael lowered his gaze. I don't know where to start. Find a path, Michael, because until you do, you'll continue being the same man who left me in the desert." Mary's words were like a dagger. They weren't cruel, they were necessary. Michael nodded slowly. "I will." Mary observed him for a moment before turning her gaze back to the papers on the counter. "Good night, Michael." Michael understood that the conversation had ended. He left the store with his heart pounding in his chest. Now he knew what he had to do, but doing it would be the most difficult thing in his life. Michael left the store with the weight of his mother's words still lodged in his chest. "Find a path, Michael, because until you do, you'll continue being the same man who left me in the desert." He stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, feeling the heat of the sun on the back of his neck, not knowing where to go. He couldn't return to his house and simply continue with his life, not after everything he had done, not after everything Mary had suffered because of him. For the first time in his life, Michael wondered what he would do with his own future. Until now, his only goal had been to seek his mother's forgiveness. But Mary was right. If his life continued to revolve around his guilt, he would never truly change. He breathed deeply and began to walk. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He only knew he had to start somewhere. That night, Michael arrived at his small apartment more exhausted than normal, not only physically but mentally. He collapsed into the kitchen chair and brought his hands to his face. All he had at that moment was a suitcase with worn clothes, a few coins in his pocket, and an uncertain opportunity for redemption. He turned on his phone and began to look for work. He spent more than an hour reviewing ads, sending applications, looking for something that would give him stability, something that would prove not only to Mary, but to himself, that he could rebuild himself. After much searching, he found an offer at a construction company. The salary was low, the work was heavy, but there was no other option. He registered without thinking twice. If he really wanted to prove he had changed, he had to start from the ground, from the same point where Mary had begun anew without him. The next day, Michael arrived at the construction site with trembling hands. He had never done physical work in his life. His entire career had been in offices, wearing expensive suits and giving orders. Now he was there with borrowed safety boots, a worn helmet, and a reflective vest. The foreman looked him up and down with a skeptical expression. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked with a mocking tone. Michael swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes." The foreman let out a dry laugh. "Well, we'll see how long you last." Michael didn't respond. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and he didn't care. The first day was hell carrying sacks of cement, moving bricks, enduring the suffocating heat without a single comfortable break. Every muscle in his body ached. Every drop of sweat that fell on his forehead reminded him that he had never really worked before. But he didn't complain. He didn't give up, not because he wanted to prove something to his boss or his coworkers, but because for the first time he wanted to prove to himself that he could be someone different. When the shift ended, Michael could barely stay on his feet. But there was something strange about him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfaction. It was the first time he had earned money with his own hands. It was the first time he felt he was really building something. That night, while he was in his small room drinking cheap coffee and looking at his dust-covered hands, he understood something. Mary didn't need to hear that he had changed. She needed to see it. And he would, even if it cost him every drop of effort. Michael didn't know if his mother would ever forgive him, but he had decided that even if she didn't, he would continue forward because, for the first time in his life, he was beginning to feel that he had a purpose. As weeks passed at the construction site, Michael's hands became calloused, his back stronger, his mind clearer. The physical labor, once foreign to him, now provided an unexpected peace. Each brick he laid, each beam he carried, became a metaphor for the rebuilding of his own character. One evening, as he sat exhausted on the edge of a foundation he'd helped dig, a young laborer offered him water from his own thermos. "My mother always says water shared tastes sweeter," the boy said simply. Michael took the thermos with trembling hands, suddenly remembering how many times Mary had sacrificed her own comfort for his, how she would skip meals so he could eat better, how she would walk miles to work when they couldn't afford bus fare. "Thank you," he whispered, both to the boy and to a mother who wasn't there to hear it. As he drank, he understood that his journey wasn't just about seeking forgiveness, It was about becoming worthy of it. About learning the value of sacrifice, of kindness, of seeing others as more than just what they could offer him. The man who had abandoned Mary in the desert wouldn't have understood this. But that man, Michael realized, no longer. Michael spent the following days immersed in work. It didn't matter how much his muscles hurt or how exhausted he was at the end of each shift at the construction site. He knew that each hour he dedicated to that effort was one more step away from the man he had been and one step closer to the man he wanted to be. But what tormented him most was Mary's indifference. He saw her every day at the store. He heard her talk with the customers. He saw her laugh with Sophie and Ernest, move with a tranquility that demonstrated she had found her place in the world, a world in which he didn't fit. He didn't bother her. He didn't insist. He didn't seek her outside of what was necessary. But every time she looked at him without emotion, without anger, but also without affection, Michael felt that an abyss opened between them, an abyss that he himself had created. That afternoon, when he finished his shift at the construction site, he decided to pass by the store before going to his apartment. He needed to buy some basic things: bread, coffee, rice, the essentials. Upon entering, he saw Mary behind the counter counting change. His mother looked up and saw him, but didn't say anything. Michael felt his heart tighten. He approached with a firm step and put the products on the counter. "Good afternoon." Mary barely nodded and began to mark the prices on the cash register. The silence between them was suffocating. Michael couldn't stand it anymore. "Mom?" Mary stopped her hands but didn't look up. Michael swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I know I told you I wouldn't call you that until you allowed it, but I can't help it." Mary exhaled softly and continued marking the products. "You don't need to call me anything to buy something." Michael pressed his lips together. "I know, but I'm not here just for that." Mary finished marking the total and said in a low voice, "That's $120. Michael took out his money and paid without arguing. He took the bag with his purchases, and when he was about to leave, Mary spoke. "You look tired." Michael felt a shiver upon hearing her. It was the first time in weeks that Mary had said something to him that wasn't strictly necessary. He turned slowly, surprised. "It's hard work," he responded sincerely. Mary nodded without elaborating. "That's good." Michael wanted to say something more, but he felt that if he pressed too much, she would close up again. So he simply nodded and left the store. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he had advanced one step, small, but important. Mary closed the store that night feeling more tired than normal. It wasn't physical exhaustion that weighed on her, but something deeper, something she had carried within her since the moment Michael returned to her life. She had tried to remain firm, to convince herself that her son no longer had a place in her heart. But every time she saw him enter through the door of the store, every time she heard his timid voice greeting, something inside her stirred. It wasn't rage, it wasn't hatred, it was pain because, although she denied it, her mother's love had never disappeared. She stayed in the back room, arranging some papers that didn't need to be organized, simply to distract herself. Sophie observed her from the other side of the counter with that wise look that Mary knew well. "You're restless." Mary sighed and put the papers aside. "I don't know what to do with Michael." Sophie approached calmly and leaned on the counter. "What do you mean?" Mary passed a hand over her face. "I see him come every day, working as if his life depended on it. But how do I know if he's really changed?" Sophie looked at her tenderly. "Don't you see it?" Mary remained silent. "You can't expect the Michael from before to disappear from one day to the next," continued Sophie. "But if there's one thing that's clear, it's that the man who's out there is not the same one who left you in the desert." Mary felt a knot in her throat. "And what do I do with that?" Sophie sighed. "What your heart tells you." But that was the problem. Mary no longer knew what her heart was telling her. She had spent so much time guarding the pain, protecting herself from the possibility that her son might hurt her again, that now she didn't know how to tear down that wall. She remained silent for a few minutes, and then, with a low voice, she murmured, "I'm still not ready to forgive him." Sophie nodded with understanding. "You don't have to do it now, but at least give yourself the opportunity to know the man he has become." Mary didn't respond. She knew she had to make a decision. She knew she couldn't live in this uncertainty forever. But she also knew that if she opened her heart too soon, it could break again. She stayed looking at the door of the store, knowing that sooner or later she would have to face the truth because Michael was still there, waiting. And she had to decide if she would ever allow him to be her son again. Mary woke up that morning feeling the weight of accumulated days in her chest. She stayed in bed for a moment with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling without moving. Since Michael had returned to her life, although she didn't want to admit it, something inside her had changed. She had spent so much time rebuilding herself, so much time learning to live without him, that now she didn't know what to do with his presence. She had spent so much time hardening her heart, convincing herself that the man who had abandoned her in the desert no longer existed in her life. But then he returned, and now each day she saw him in the store, in the construction site, in the small gestures that evidenced his effort to rebuild himself. He wasn't the same. Michael had changed. And that terrified her because if she accepted that he was really another person, then she would have to admit that she still loved him. And if she still loved him, then what remained of her new life? Sophie appeared beside her with a soft smile. "Today you're more quiet than usual." Mary let out a sigh and leaned on the counter. "I've been thinking about Michael." Sophie didn't seem surprised. "I imagined." Mary looked out the window. "I don't know what to do with what I feel." Sophie crossed her arms. "Are you still angry with him?" Mary shook her head. "Not anymore." Sophie observed her with curiosity. "Then what do you feel?" Mary pressed her lips together. "Fear." Sophie arched her eyebrows. "What happens if I lose him forever?" Sophie smiled tenderly. "That's a question that only you can answer." Mary breathed deeply. She knew Sophie was right. She knew she couldn't continue avoiding the truth. Michael had changed, and she had to decide if she was ready to accept him back into her life, because if she didn't, maybe this time it would be she who lost him forever. Mary woke up with a different sensation that day. Something inside her, something that had been tangled in her chest for a long time, seemed to have loosened. She stayed a few moments in bed looking at the ceiling, remembering everything that had happened. The night before, Mary had stood at her window, staring at the stars that dotted the dark Phoenix sky. They were the same stars that had witnessed her abandonment in the desert, the same ones that had given her hope when she thought all was lost. She thought of Michael not as he had been that terrible day, but as the little boy who once gazed at those same stars with wonder, his small hand in hers. Some stars die, Ernest had told her once, but from their death, new ones are born. Perhaps people were like stars, too. Perhaps the Michael she had known had died in that desert, but a new one was struggling to be born. And perhaps, she realized, the Mary who had entered that desert had also died, giving way to the stronger woman she had become. It wasn't about forgetting the pain, it was about choosing whether that pain would define her future. She had rebuilt her life. She had learned to live without the weight of the past. She had found in Ernest and Sophie the support of a family she never imagined having. And now Michael was still there. He was no longer the arrogant man who had discarded her without hesitation. He was no longer the son who thought his mother was a burden. Now he was a man who worked under the scorching sun, who carried cement with his own hands, who accepted his guilt without demanding forgiveness. Mary sighed deeply and got up. That morning, when she arrived at the store, Sophie observed her in silence. Mary didn't say anything, but her expression said it all. "Are you ready?" Sophie asked softly. Mary nodded. Yes. Michael arrived at the store like every day, but something felt different. He had learned not to expect anything from Mary, to be content with seeing her from afar, with the small gestures that suggested that maybe, just maybe, she had begun to accept him again. But when he entered the store that morning, Mary was waiting for him. Michael felt his heart stop for a second. She looked at him with a neutral expression, but in her eyes, there was something different. "Sit down, Michael," she said calmly. Michael obeyed without saying anything. There was a long silence between them. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what you did," began Mary with a firm voice. "I don't know if my heart can erase the pain." Michael lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of those words. "I understand," he murmured. Mary breathed deeply. "But I also see what you've done." Michael looked up, surprised. "I saw you rebuild yourself. I saw you learn what it means to work hard. I saw you accept the consequences of your actions without fleeing." Michael swallowed hard. "I didn't do it for you to forgive me." Mary tilted her head. "I know. And that's why, for the first time, I feel that maybe I can try." The air seemed to become lighter in the store. Michael felt a wave of emotions catch in his throat. "You mean?" Mary managed a slight smile. "I mean, I'm willing to see if we can recover something of what we were, but at my pace, in my way." Michael nodded, feeling something hot burning in his eyes. "At your pace, however you want." Mary breathed deeply. "I don't promise you that everything will be as before." Michael smiled sadly. "I don't want it to be like before. I want it to be better." Mary looked at him for a moment more, then nodded slowly. "Then we'll see if that's possible." As they stood there, in the quiet setting of the late afternoon, both mother and son understood that a new chapter of their lives had just opened. Michael felt a genuine peace, not an escape, but a liberation from facing his mistakes and choosing to change. Mary gently touched his hand, a small gesture, but one that contained an entire journey of forgiveness and love. The deepest wounds may take a lifetime to heal, but in that moment, in the desert that had witnessed betrayal, they found what they thought was lost forever: hope. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories, and leave a comment below. What do you think is stronger, forgiveness or revenge? We look forward to hearing your thoughts.